When it comes to creative media, horror, much like many other genres, has shown quite a few substantial evolutions throughout the years. The genre itself is inherently interesting to me from the view of what these projects are ultimately trying to achieve. You've got films made to make you laugh, ones to make you cry, but horror films are constantly trying to draw the most visceral reactions out of the viewer, making them jump, making them feel anxious, nervous, and overwhelmed with dread. When laid out like that, I'd likely say that would sound rather unappealing to many people, and I suppose that will be the case for some. But on the other side, you've got many others who adore these horror-related projects, and get a buzz out of the long suspenseful periods leading up to a deafening jump scare. As I discussed in my Five Nights at Freddy's series, however, this horror can be conveyed in many different ways. And I'd say because of how reliant the genre as a whole is based around the audience members' emotions, horror also finds itself in a rather tough spot when it comes to pleasing all parties. You'll have some people wanting jump scares, and others who think they're cheap, some wanting a chilling atmosphere, while others think that's boring and not extreme enough. To use a recent example, I very much felt that myself when playing the much-derided Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. Aside from the bugs in that game, which totally deserved criticism, I disagreed with much of what I heard in regards to the game's atmosphere and the game's ultimate intentions, but that's perhaps because I wasn't looking at it as a horror game whatsoever. Security Breach is basically a horror game in name only. While fans didn't appreciate the bright surroundings and lackluster jump scares, I oftentimes found myself either appreciative or rather nonplussed by these things because of how I was personally perceiving the game. It brings up an interesting point in regards to the genre as a whole. I don't personally perceive Security Breach as a horror game because of how many things I see within it that are intentionally not trying to be scary. But does that mean I should perceive it and judge it in that way? I would never criticize someone with issues regarding the genre it's working in, as if it's being marketed and advertised in that way, you would hope to have that backed up to some extent. You could say the same about many of the films someone like David Lynch made. Many of them feature elements that would fit right into the horror genre, but there's also so much surrounding those elements that people eventually just described as work as Lynchian, a whole genre that's defined by Lynch's unique style. All of this goes to say that feelings of horror and dread can be conveyed in numerous different ways, many of which will succeed and fail when it comes to who's interacting with the piece of media. And in terms of what we're talking about today, I'd say the series we're going to discuss is a great example of something that will be insanely intriguing to some and far too polarizing for others. And that comes from both undeniable positives and negatives in terms of how these games have been designed from a stylistic and mechanical point of view. The Siren series has always been an interesting one for me, as renowned as it is in certain circles, and for as unique and terrifying I've always perceived it to be. It's one of those game series that's only ever really had a cult following. There's only been 3 games released in the series, those being Siren 1 and 2, which were both released for the PS2, also going under the name Forbidden Siren, and Siren Blood Curse for the PS3. While the team behind these games is referred to as Project Siren, the series was ultimately conceived by Keichiro Toyama, who was best known at the time for directing the first entry in the Silent Hill franchise. And I'd say that much like other video game auteurs like Hideo Kojima, you can very much feel his unique presence throughout every one of his games. Playing through any of the Siren games, for example, it wouldn't be surprising to find out that the main man behind them also had a big hand in kickstarting the Silent Hill franchise. Taking a look at the first game, I'd argue that what we see here is the main reason this game, and all of the games in the series, never resulted in a big hit. As I say, these games are known to an extent, but we're not talking anywhere near the levels of a Silent Hill or Resident Evil. The positives are thrown right in your face from the very start for me. Title screens can be especially important when it comes to horror games. They can work in setting the tone for the overall experience, and Sirens does a great job at that, getting the twisted, morphing sounds of the siren to begin with, before eventually having other disturbing sounds overlaid on top of it. The highlight, outside the siren obviously, being the deep groans and singing we hear in the back, working well to establish the series theme that we'll hear carried across to the other games. As for the game itself, the plot is one that essentially gets repeated across all the other titles. Intentionally so, I might add. The opening cutscene shows a teenage boy, referred to as Kyo Yasuda, investigating a strange occurrence in a fog-laden forest.
Who is it?
Waiting till nighttime, he witnesses what seems to be some kind of ritual taking place, where upon getting spotted, he runs away before encountering some kind of zombified police officer.
Who's there? Huh? Who is it?
There's quite a few things to praise here to begin with, many of which apply to the game as a whole. I think the cutscenes in this game look fantastic, and have aged incredibly well. Because of aspects like the rather intense film grain we see, the lighting, and also the immense darkness of most scenes, there's many points where things are made to seem genuinely lifelike, kind of similar to how I perceive the cutscenes in Silent Hill 2. But much like that game, there's also a brilliant uncanny feeling that can be felt in these, most noticeably when it comes to the characters' faces. As you're able to see, all of the characters' features are rendered out digitally, like you'd expect, but when it comes to their facial features, you can see especially in their eyes and mouths, these are actually the faces of real life actors that are getting transposed onto these models. This creates something so uncanny and creepy that I was basically unable to connect with any of the characters, including the ones we play as. But I think that's ultimately a good thing. If the faces alone can make me feel unsettled during the entire experience, the other elements surrounding that can only amplify those feelings even more. And that most definitely applies to the appearance of the zombified creatures we come across, going under the name shibito, which simply means corpse person in Japanese. It should be said right from the off, these aren't your regular zombie, these are something far more bizarre. This can be seen from the very first one we meet. After getting cornered by the police officer, Suda ends up getting shot, in which the shibito then starts laughing as he falls off the road. Two unique things about these guys immediately, both of which feed into the ultimate human characteristic they seem to have. It's a really strange hybrid that's equally extreme as it is goofy. I have seen elements of these things in other experiences. You've had zombie-like figures shooting guns in the Resi games, for example, and there's also many other examples of games with zombies that are far more sentient and intelligent, but it's the pairing of all these elements and the extremeness of these characteristics, which is what makes the shibito particularly stand out for me. We'll get into them deeper when discussing Blood Curse, but getting into my overall thoughts on these first two experiences, while they do a great job in setting up the story and worlds that I feel Blood Curse eventually thrives off, there's one huge issue that I also think permeates throughout the series at large, and that's the gameplay. Aside from the relatively tame marketing I always felt the Siren games suffered from, I think even the most hardcore fan would have to admit, these aren't the best games to actually play. In fact, they're not even close. Siren 1 and 2 were especially frustrating experiences for me, because the elements that surround the gameplay I found to be absolutely fantastic. As I say, the world that's created, the bizarre encounters we have, the superb soundtrack that accompanies us throughout, all of these things are genuinely bordering perfection in my opinion. There were so many points where I found myself with chills, completely terrified, when nothing was even really happening, which as you can see in some of these examples is generated directly from the sound and visuals, elements outside of how we're interacting with the experience. The soundtrack in the back is already incredibly unnerving, which I'd say applies to all the music we hear in these games. But look at the visuals which accompany that soundtrack. In most games, I talk about aspects like the scenery and the texture work we're seeing, and while all those things are here and still look good for when this game was released, it's more about what we don't see that's the biggest strength for me. When our flashlight's off, there's points where we can honestly see almost nothing except for what's in our immediate surroundings. Pair that up with the horrific creatures that wander around these levels, creating these bizarre sounds while chasing after you in the pitch black darkness, and you've got amazing potential for some fantastically memorable situations to play out all while you're in control. Something I find to be especially important. Cutscenes are only one piece to the puzzle. Many games, especially nowadays, seem to struggle when it comes to making their gameplay match up with what's shown in the pre-planned cutscenes. In games like these, however, even despite their linear nature, one single encounter with a shibito could entirely change the way you navigate a level and carry out your objectives successfully. As I say though, we'll delve into these aspects even deeper with Blood Curse. I'll leave these first two games off by highlighting a major positive and negative, however, as these are very important towards how we see the team attempt to refine and evolve these elements in the future. Starting with the positive, I think the game's storylines and the way in which they're conveyed is superb. These are games with quite a bit of lore. There's many details and plot threads I either didn't know or was confused about before I researched more online. To put it simply, however, the general events of Siren are all based around being stuck inside of a nightmarish loop, with the concept concept of the Ouroboros being presented prominently at points in the series. There's many different timelines and assumed universes we see and take part in throughout these games. The only thing is, none of these details are particularly conveyed to the player in any outward fashion. The ritual we see at the start, the earthquake that occurs shortly after, the cause of the shibito outbreak. Much of this stuff isn't directly explained to the player in the events of the core game, but I think that's great, as it develops a great deal of intrigue and will have players actively wanting to discover these more hidden details themselves. The deeper you get into the game, and the more bizarre events and creatures you come up against, you'll be asking even more questions in regards to how and why all of this is happening. And as the world that's created is already so inherently interesting in my opinion, there's not many points where I even felt like a clear answer was particularly necessary. There's so many things in these games where you'll be asking yourself, what is that? And why is that here? And we'll never get a clear answer. And while I feel some players will want absolute clarity over anything else, I find these games almost earn the right to adopt this kind of approach. It becomes quite clear when embarking on any of these games that we're delving into something perhaps a bit more experimental than your usual video game. And in going off the rails, which they end up doing at many points throughout these games, there are times where you're basically told to sit back and just embrace what you're witnessing. And it's that experimentation that I feel is the story's strongest trait. There's a fearlessness and confidence in the way Siren executes its story that I find to be incredibly ambitious. As I say, you can feel how there's been a large degree of thought behind the world of Siren, not just the events we personally witness. And as a result, this village of Hanuda that we find ourselves exploring across all three entries ends up having a distinctiveness that sets itself apart from most other horror games surrounding it in my opinion. Now, the negative I brought up is the only thing I feel will stand in the way of someone wanting to actively experience the fascinating world and story of Siren, but having experienced these games myself, it's gonna be a pretty massive hurdle to get over for many. Let's just lay all the cards on the table. The gameplay in these first two games is nothing short of horrendous. For the few positives I took away from certain mechanics and the behaviour of the shibito, those were overshadowed tenfold when it came down to how we navigate these levels and progress forward. That darkness I talked about that does a great job in creating a terrifying atmosphere, in gameplay terms, it can oftentimes be a nightmare, with a resulting experience that will have you aimlessly wandering around with no real clue on where you should be going, with the only real form of guidance coming from a sole objective on the menu screen, one which oftentimes doesn't guide you whatsoever. I've talked about these kinds of experiences in the past, and how I've actually enjoyed the freedom of not being handheld through a video game, but Siren takes things to an extreme in my opinion, becoming frustrating to the point where I didn't find any enjoyment in what I was doing. I found myself lost in levels, I found myself searching for items for an absurd amount of time, I've gotten stuck in positions where restarting the level is my only way out. These games can be very difficult to get through without a guide, but with all that being said, individually, I haven't got a huge problem once again. I don't inherently mind getting lost or having to search a while for an item, as long as you're taking in more of the atmosphere and dealing with threats along the way, but that's where the visuals and navigation can drag the experience down. With the memory of FNAF Security Breach still fresh in my mind, I remember praising that game for the exact same thing I'm chastising the first couple Siren games for. Reason being, I could actually see something in Security Breach, whereas in Siren 1 and 2, everything's oftentimes so dark to where I'm hardly taking anything in. That's not a slant on the environments, as I said, I do enjoy them. It's simply that in my opinion, once you're made to roam around one of these levels for a prolonged amount of time, with the sole aim of finding something like a key or a wire that could quite literally be anywhere, the environments and atmosphere, while still strong, aren't enough to curb that frustration for me personally. That's arguably my main issue when it came to the gameplay realistically. As I say, these first two especially are ones that newer players will almost definitely find themselves searching for guides online, due to them being unable to progress. Within all this, there's other annoyances and underwhelming elements that made the gameplay experience even more lackluster however. The incredibly simplistic combat that remains a constant throughout all these games, the absurdly difficult puzzles that border on being outright unfair, and not to mention the unbearably slow crouch walking from Siren 1. These are the reasons you can start pointing to as to why Siren has never been a very popular franchise. I've seen people describe the first game especially as one of the toughest horror games of all time, and I have no problem with that viewpoint. That's the biggest frustration to me ultimately. You're having to actively go out your way to experience what at the core of Siren is some really excellent and original horror. It's just the fact that on your way to experience that stuff, your time with the game may already be ruined because of what it may take to reach it in the first place. Even though I've derided the majority of the gameplay in these first couple games, and stand by my view that I think the world is where my true interest lies, there are some truly original gameplay concepts here that eventually get refined in Blood Curse to great effect. The highlight for me having to be the sight jacking mechanic, a form of surveillance realistically, allowing us to observe the perspectives moves of the shibito in each level. This gives us the opportunity to map out a path forward more effectively, as once you're aware there's a shibito overlooking a nearby road for example, you'd be foolish to then waltz down that same road without expecting to get spotted. Equally though, sightjacking is also used occasionally for these more puzzle-based moments, being able to see certain combinations on locks for example. A brilliant concept in my opinion, with a great amount of potential that I do feel gets capitalised on perhaps even more in these first two games compared to Blood Curse. With that being said though, much like numerous facets of these games, there's also an undeniable refinement that we see in Blood Curse that simply makes features like the sightjacking slightly more functional and easy to use. And turning our attention to Blood Curse, or New Translation as it's referred to in Japan, this is the title in the series that I'd assume most players who are unfamiliar with the prior games would have had the best chance of discovering, or at least hearing about. Blood Curse was released only around a couple years after Siren 2. However, between this time, another technological jump occurred in the gaming scene when it came to the release of the PS3 and Xbox 360. It's worth noting that when it came to Siren 2, that was the only game to not be released in North America, with many fans speculating this was maybe down to aspects like certain licensing issues, or perhaps just a reaction to the lackluster response to the first game in that part of the world. Either way, I think it's fairly easy to assume that choosing to not release a sequel to your game series to such a wide audience will likely only result in it becoming even more obscure and less talked about. Funnily enough, the way I discovered the game almost encapsulates how I imagine many people end up discovering the Siren games. It wasn't through any advertising or marketing material in the real world, but instead in a piece of marketing found in the PS3's PlayStation Home app. Much like many other players, I used to love going on PlayStation Home to try out all the different experiences, with me discovering many other games in this time beside the likes of Siren. The minigame we got to indulge in here was referred to as Ward of Despair, a level that, as we'll eventually see, is closely emulating one of the actual levels in the main game. This sole minigame was captivating enough for me to want to investigate even deeper, and upon checking on the PlayStation Store, I was left rather confused. In what would soon become a rather common trend in the upcoming years, Blood Curse was the first time I'd ever personally seen a game be released in the form of episodes. All of this is worth taking into account, as it all adds to why there's so many people who've never played and never even heard of the Siren franchise to begin with. The idea of releasing games in this episode format was a very new concept, one that was basically brought about with the invention of these online stores. It had been attempted before, of course, with games releasing add-on packs as a physical piece of media, but it was due to this digital ease of access where the likes of Siren, and later on, the Walking Dead games would go all out on this idea. The only issue for Siren, in my opinion, was that with a game series that already wasn't very well known, convoluting the process in which players can get their hands on it wasn't a very good idea in hindsight. Not to mention as well, considering how the game ultimately handles this whole episodic concept, there's a strong argument to say it's not even that necessary in the first place. Getting into the game itself, this title screen is one that, despite its relative simplicity, does a fantastic job in setting the tone of the experience. I already discussed how important these initial moments can be to unsettle the player before the game's already begun, and this game's quite literally a perfect example of that. There's two factors in a visual sense that I feel are carried across to essentially the entire experience, and that's the pairing of brutality and beauty at the same time. The red colour we're seeing in the back obviously draws our mind directly to the blood part of the title. However, in that gruesome visual, we see many ripples getting created in this blood, giving all these screens a bit more visual flair. This equally applies to the music we hear in the back. The tune we hear is yet another iteration of the ritual theme we've heard across the previous games, but this time we also have some additional instrumentation when it comes to the distant violin strings we hear in the back, once again presenting a track that remains superbly ominous, but now with an additional piece of artistry that deepens it even more. With this being the main theme of the series, I'd also like to state how great the theme is in itself, and particularly why it takes so many players like myself out of their comfort zone. This is where it should be established that Siren Blood Curse is basically a remake of the first game. We're not going beat for beat, it's not a remake that's emulating exactly what we saw in the first game, but it follows the same general concept. The key thing that distinguishes them, however, is what people describe as the Americanization we see in Blood Curse. Japanese characters being swapped out for Americans to once again try appeal to audiences outside of Japan.
Ugh, I feel like I'm some goddamn zombie or something. Damn it, where are those shots coming from?
This is a trait of Blood Curse I feel I actually admire a whole lot more than other fans do. There's an argument thrown around saying it takes away from the unique Japanese feel the prior two games had. But one, I don't think that's necessarily true in the first place, and two, I feel that areas which are Americanized to a degree only go to enhance the experience for me personally.
今作では、ですね、異文化からの視点ですね。日本の、山奥の村に、海外のスタッフというか外国人が紛れ込んでその異文化の恐怖にさらされるというそういうところを重視して作ってます。
As a Westerner myself, I can feel that very strongly throughout the game, including this title screen. I don't speak Japanese, and I'm not particularly familiar with much of their culture, and as a result, the music to me does a great job in making me feel out of place, with this applying to the ritual version of this same theme as well. The ominous chanting we hear in the back is being delivered in a language that I quite literally don't understand at all, and the general theme isn't the same kind of music I'm used to hearing either. All of this goes to say that for an aspect of the game I find this criticised to a certain degree compared to the other games, I've personally got no issue with it. It's an aspect that will obviously vary depending on what part of the world you're from, and how in tune you are with Japanese culture in general, but I'd say their ultimate intention in appealing to the Western audiences works effectively for someone like me. Starting from episode 1, we're given the general setup from a few lines of text that flash up on screen, but even then, there's still no clarity given whatsoever on the actual events we're told about. In 1976, a village deep in the mountains of Japan vanished overnight. We have next to no idea on how something like that would have happened currently, so from the very first line of text, we've got a shocking revelation, but one that seems to be so nonsensical that it creates a good deal of intrigue. From there, we end up hearing the brand new American cast whispering amongst themselves, with all the footage we're seeing on screen actually being live action.
What are they doing? I thought this was an abandoned village. Who are those people?
The latter of those being another fantastic decision to begin with, adding to the uncanny factor the game oftentimes presents by having the player question what they're looking at right from the off. The footage is so grainy, shaky, and dark that it's unclear to begin with if we're looking at something occurring in real life or in the video game. And as the cutscene continues and we realise we are in fact looking at a real life environment with real people, it makes the ultimate sacrifice we see even more shocking. This is one of the only moments that was actually censored in the North American release, with the footage of the woman getting stabbed getting obscured by even more intense camera shaking. I love most things about this intro. The distorted footage we're watching that seems to be heavily inspired by the likes of the Blair Witch Project, the discussions we're hearing between the Americans that serve as a way to connect with the audience, and also the unnerving ceremony we watch play out in front of us. The only issue I have is one that permeates throughout the entire experience ultimately, and that's how it's very hard to see what's actually going on. I get that is the point to an extent. The decision to have a shaky handheld camera capturing a very dark scene was clearly intentional, but it's done to a point where I imagine there'll be people playing who have next to no idea what's going on, literally because they can't see. Outside that, the events we witness are ones that I assume will be quite rewarding upon repeat playthroughs of the game, with there being a few characters who show up in this ritual that we see later on, giving a deal of clarity in regards to their involvement and what role they had during it. The ritual's eventually interrupted by another American, appearing to hit one of the people in the face while telling them to leave someone alone. Shortly after, we get our first glimpse of how the actual game looks, and I'll be honest, even from this very first scene, in a graphical sense, I think you can see how well this game's aged. We'll get into this a bit more later on, but not only do I find the game look superb from a texture point of view, it's arguably the lighting that I think is the game's strongest trait in the visual department. An important thing to know, as I do equally feel that as much as it does for the visual side of things, it could become an absolute frustration on the gameplay side. Additionally, it should be mentioned that with our first look at some of the cast we'll be dealing with this time, you also get an immediate tonal switch up when it comes to the character Sam Monroe who shows up at the end.
Is she the actress that you guys hired?
The first couple games featured elements that you could perhaps laugh at in a twisted kind of way, but I don't recollect anything as outwardly comic relief as this initial moment, and especially not during the same intro sequences. And while not consistent, we do see this same kind of comic relief turn up in a few more spots throughout the game, something that I imagine hardcore fans of the original won't be a big fan of either. As for the person who disrupted the ritual, this guy's name is Howard Wright, who essentially works as the main protagonist. Upon making his way into a nearby shack, we're finally given control, allowing us us to briefly observe our surroundings before stepping outside and eventually encountering a police officer. As for this brief moment where we're given control, even in this tiny room we're placed in, we can immediately see the fantastic level of detail that's gone into every element of the environment here, and that translates to quite literally every single area in the game. Everything here feels incredibly authentic, which only amplifies those feelings of being lost and alone even more. Every single piece of text we see is being written in Japanese. Even look into the faces of the people scattered around the walls. There's nobody here with the same kind of appearance as our American protagonist. Unlike other parts of Japan that would very much appeal to tourists, we can immediately feel how we found ourselves in a more rural part of the country, one that perhaps is less welcoming to outsiders. And stepping outside, we end up coming face to face with one of the residents around here, and as you could assume, he isn't particularly friendly.
了解、射殺します。
Hey, wait, what are you...
Much like the start of Siren 1, the first shibito we end up running into was the police sergeant, getting out of his car and instantly opening fire on us. All of the characteristics I mentioned the first time round are equally as strange as when we met this guy before. Despite appearing as this zombified figure, this guy has the ability to communicate, use weapons, and even drive a car as we saw a second ago. The concept of a shibito remains terrifying from the off, as we're made aware that unlike your typical zombie, the capabilities these guys hold is more up in the air. They're breaking the conventions we're used to, and in acting far more human, they then become a whole lot more intimidating. Intelligence is arguably the main advantage humans have over the undead in the many varying iterations I've seen. For what they may provide in numbers and durability, humans are always shown they're able to outsmart and overpower them with their minds. The shibito essentially removes that safety net. These guys appear to be out for blood, and seem to be functioning like normal. After this, we're put straight into the gameplay, simply being told to escape the police officer and reach a house that's apparently nearby. Now, for as much as I think the effect of any horror media wears off the more you experience them, there's always something about the opening of Blood Curse that still terrifies me to this day. The setup's already terrifying from the police officer alone, but the fact that we're thrown right into the deep end and are told to just escape, it leaves us with no other option than to simply run away. We're made to feel incredibly vulnerable. We can't defend ourselves due to the gun that's getting shot at us, and as we start running away, we'll soon find the police officer will actively start chasing us. From the very first objective, however, we run into something that could heavily enhance or detract from the experience of certain players, and that's the immense darkness of the scene. As someone who's played this game many times already, I feel like I'm now in a position where I can majorly appreciate the darkness and the atmosphere it generates. In obscuring the environment and the figures we see lurking around this darkness, we're made to overlook certain details at points, run right past effective hiding spots, and potentially run right into threats that we're ultimately trying to avoid. Not to mention, because of how the lighting in this game's been implemented, when looking to the horrifying shibito we encounter, the darkness and the small semblance of light we do see reflected on their models, it ends up turning them into an even more blood-chilling threat than they already are. That works especially well during an opening segment like this. When it comes to those playing for the first time, you're going to find yourself scrambling around the darkness, desperately attempting to find the right path forward. All the while, you've got the police officer firing at you and running right for you in the pitch black darkness. Even just laying it out like that makes it feel terrifying, but I'd be lying if I didn't say there was also a potential problem in that. Say you find yourself in a situation where because of this darkness, it takes you quite a while to find a way to the house. One that I'll admit is not only obscured by the lack of light, but also the rather intense amount of vegetation we see. For all the good I feel this does in the visual department, I would have no issue with someone criticising how this affects the gameplay. We have to bear in mind that while the initial few attempts of scrambling around the darkness and getting caught by the policeman may be terrifying, have that go on for too long, and the scares will soon become frustration. And unlike other instances, I wouldn't pin much of this frustration on the player for being unable to find their way forward, as the game itself gives them near to no indication on where to go. I've discussed this before in the context of other games that provide a great deal of darkness to their environments. What you typically see are light sources being placed in areas to almost guide the player forward, either in a way to directly illuminate the path forward, or perhaps having the lights present a breadcrumb trail of sorts. Siren essentially has none of that. It's going for something far more atmospheric and realistic, something I can appreciate appreciate on its own, but undoubtedly opens itself up for a reasonable amount of criticism. I feel both these factors are highlighted even more when we eventually find the house. We're told that we need to find a place to hide, which is where the negative factor can present itself. The only place to hide currently is directly under the house, with this hiding spot being found right at the end, and being shrouded in complete darkness before you illuminate it with your flashlight. And even then, if you don't find yourself standing in a close enough position, you could still end up missing it completely. However, the scene that occurs upon reaching this hiding spot highlights some of the positives in this approach. The intense degree of suspense I feel from situations like this is fantastic, and this occurs several times throughout the game. We can really see at this point that it's not purely darkness we're dealing with here, it's also the fact the contrast in this game has been cranked up to an extreme extent. What would have otherwise just been a shadow were now made to be pure undecipherable areas, where quite literally nothing can be seen, as is shown off in this case with the body that's laying in front of us. When looking to areas like his eyes or torso, it's nearly impossible to make out what we're looking at. We know it's a body of some kind, but almost every single detail of it is hard to identify, working effectively to create a fear of the unknown, which of course is only made even more intense from the atmosphere and soundtrack that's accompanying these elements. Alongside that, other details get highlighted more prominently in these darker surroundings. The overwhelming film grain that covers our screen, the rain that's falling from the sky, the arrival of the policeman that makes our heart drop even more than it otherwise would. All of these aspects are once again made more effective because of that lack of clarity in my opinion. Even in the case of the film grain, I'm typically not a fan of this effect in video games whatsoever, and if I'm being honest, if I had the option, I probably would still turn it off. But as that's not a choice, I can at least say that compared to many other games, where I feel this effect clouds the player's vision for no good reason, you can naturally assume the grain only enhances everything I've just been talking about. More obscuration, more confusion, but simultaneously, that makes things feel even more terrifying. It's more cinematic and more realistic in a way. Making our way into the house, while you are able to get past this entire section remaining completely undetected, as you can see in my case, the nightmarish situations you can face results in moments that are absurdly scary in my opinion. The atmosphere I've alluded to is truly one of a kind. There's not many other games that have me completely ignoring the mechanical side of things, and what I can and can't get away with. In Blood Curse though, if I'm in a position like this, where I've been spotted by the police officer and have him shouting at me to come back, I'm running and hiding as fast as I possibly can. This whole section inside the house is both tense, from how we need to either hide inside a closet in the front room or inside the bathroom, but also informative from the residents we see inside here. Up till now, we've only seen the police officer and the guy outside who he ends up shooting, but the immensely gory states we see the other two residents in when looking around the house confirms this isn't a self-contained incident. There's something going on in the village at large. Once again, it's reinforcing that feeling of being totally out of our element. We've now quite literally stumbled into a horrific scene without knowing quite yet what the cause of it is. What's happened to the people here? Why have they been massacred in such a disturbing fashion? This will obviously become clearer the deeper we get into the game, but it leaves the player both petrified yet also interested to see where the game's going. And talking of the states we find them in, this is the first case where the gore in this game is thrown right in the player's face. To this day, Siren Blood Curse may possibly be one of the most grotesque games I've ever played. But again, I wouldn't say that's necessarily from what's actually shown. It's more about the way in which it's presented. If we're talking objectively, you would have to say games like Gears of War or the recent Doom games feature gore that's far more extreme than what we see here. But again, it's about the context in which this gore is applied. Those two examples I've just given use that violence to make you feel like more of a badass, whereas here, it's used to actively shock and disgust you. And that's another key towards why the gore oftentimes works so well. In so many things we see throughout the game, there's such a bizarreness and abnormal quality to everything, that I do still feel a shocking sensation when witnessing much of it. Even in the house we've just been talking about, while the woman dead in the front room could be described as fairly standard, the guy we find in the bathtub with blood splattered on the walls, and the liquid itself appearing to be a pool of blood, the presentation of this is stark and sickening to where the assumed perpetrator, that being the shibitos, become an even more sizable threat in our minds. And that's only reinforced even more when coming to the end of this first mission. When making our way outside and collecting a shovel, we essentially get ambushed by the police officer who jumps out the house. However, upon seemingly beating him to death with our shovel, he wakes back up, in which Howard inflicts an even more brutal outcome on him when pushing him off a nearby drop. Once again, pay attention to what's being used here to create this gruesome visual. As the scene's so dark, we don't get a great view of anything anyway, and alongside that, due to how the camera's getting moved around, the worst thing we see is likely the shot where it pans out, showing the blood dripping down and the officer eventually turning motionless. Sound plays such a big factor in this instance, as well as across the entire game. The twisted sounds of pain coming out of the policeman, and the disgusting squelching sounds of him landing on the object. It creates an effect that's far more disturbing than it otherwise would be. After this, we cut back to the TV crew, and almost instantly, you can see where some more issues would arise for certain players.
And why are you still wearing those glasses I gave you? Who keeps presents from their ex-wife? God, get rid of them already!
Hey! Cut it out!
Hey!
These are the only
What's wrong with
glasses
you
that
two?
I've got!
We just saw a goddamn murder and you're bickering over stupid shit!
Just listen to those performances. The only one there that sounds even passable to me is the character Sol. Melissa and Sam do sound pretty horrendous.
Cut it out!
And the little girl who's standing beside them arguably has the worst performance in the entire game, as we're about to find out.
Help! Daddy, Mommy! Where are you?
I will say though, this first interaction, for whatever reason, is particularly bad. Melissa, for example, doesn't sound anywhere near as bad as this for pretty much the entire rest of the game.
But it's definitely a sign of a cult.
Oh, Bella, where are you?
But while I don't think the vast majority of these voice performances are as bad as the really strange British voices we heard in the first game,
It looks like you've been taking good care of my sister. Thanks for that.
it'd be a stretch to say they're all that great. There is a degree to which I think their performances are intentionally over the top at certain points. But even despite that, I was never particularly impressed with what I was hearing in this department. Yuri Lowenthal, for example, takes on the role of Howard Wright, a voice actor I'm very familiar with, and I'm quite a big fan of. And even though I find he delivers one of the best performances in the game, I'd equally say he's the best example of that exaggeration I'm talking about.
How could they have just murdered her like that? Goddamn psychos!
And also, how some of them do potentially suffer from what I'd assume is some poorly translated, or simply bad writing. The best thing about this cutscene, however, is our proper introduction to the shibito, with this coming in the form of the nurse character Yuki, who we see appear several times throughout the game, and also the re-emergence of the police officer, who eventually shoots Howard off a bridge, exactly the same as what happened to Suda. I perceive this introduction almost as a showcase of what makes Siren so unique from other survival horror games surrounding it. The foreboding music in the back that puts the TV crew, as well as the player, into a form of stasis as we encounter the shibito, the behaviour we witness from them, laughing manically and seeming to resonate with the siren that starts playing. And of course, there's the siren itself, one of the most ominous and distinct sounds I associate with the series. As you can see when reaching the end of this episode, as well as every time we start a new one, they very much stay close to the idea of this being a cinematic experience akin to a gritty television program, getting a next time and previously on screen to both cap off and begin each episode. It's another thing I'm rather nonplussed by. I remember quite a few games around this same time trying something similar, and I assume in this case it's predominantly being used to keep in line with a more cinematic, episodic based structure, directly emulating the way many TV shows give a teaser for the upcoming episode, and a recap for those who tune in the following week. The idea just never particularly works when implemented in this way though. I'm all for story recaps in games. I actually see that as a huge problem for casual players who don't have the liberty to sit and play for hours on end every day. There are going to be people who pick up a game, drop it for a week or two, and then come back to it. Only issue is, without any kind of recap, there's many times where players will not only be confused about where they left off in the story, but also situations where they don't know how to progress forward either. I have to assume the recaps were done more as an aesthetic thing, compared to being outright practical. There's no real need for a teaser for an upcoming episode, when you can quite literally play it in a matter of seconds. And there's no real need for a constant recap if the players just experienced the previous one. Only have these appear for players returning to the game, and I'd say they serve a great function, but as they are, they can actually be quite annoying for those who just want to get on with the experience. Heading into episode 2, we get our inevitable recap, where much like all of the recaps throughout the game, it's directly connected to that actual intro cutscene to the episode. Meaning that annoyingly, if you want to watch the opening cutscene of episode 2, you have to watch the recap of episode 1. As for what we see here, we've now switched perspectives to Sam Monroe, finding himself at Hanuda Mine, and upon making his way up the nearby stairway, we get another graphic encounter between a shibito and a miner who assumedly worked here. Absurdly creepy stuff, but there's a lot to pick out, much of which relates to elements of the story which are rather integral, yet still left mostly unexplained when playing through the game like normal. One of the most important is the revelation at the beginning when Sam observes a liquid dropping on his watch. We get confirmation that the rain which we see fall for the vast majority of the game is actually red. As you could assume, this is eventually confirmed to be blood that's falling from the sky. However, in the prior games, this substance was simply referred to as red water. Despite its gruesome appearance, red water is actually made to sound quite advantageous when hearing about it. It's described as holding huge regenerative capabilities, healing wounds and replacing any blood lost from those who found themselves injured. This not only applies to the narrative, but the gameplay as well, with all the Siren games having this rain heal any damage you sustain at a far quicker rate compared to if you're inside. However, there is a caveat to what initially seems like some kind of miracle substance. As the red water finds itself actively replacing the blood someone may lose, there'll come a point where they've got no more blood and only have red water circulating around their body, and when that point comes, that's when someone turns into a shibito. And trust me, as we'll eventually see, the vast majority of the characters we witness are in no way immune to that transformation either. Once you discover this, I find it makes the world of Siren even more terrifying. It's a reminder that quite literally everyone in this village has a good chance of coming back to life as one of these things, with the cause of death not even mattering. As I say, we're not suffering a bite from a zombie and gradually transforming. Someone could get injured or maybe even die without any involvement from a shibito and still come back as one. It's also another detail that I find makes these guys all the more horrific. It's not a case you typically see of a corpse simply becoming reanimated. There's a strange substance coursing throughout the shibito's bodies, making them seem even more otherworldly. And as you can see in all their designs, that's actually backed up in their appearance. Their skin's basically devoid of colour, all of these shibitos are pale as can be, and now we know the reason. No matter how it happened, there's no more blood left in that body, with the vast majority of these shibito having that highlighted in the crimson red blood that's shown on their clothing, or pouring out of their eyes and mouth. As for the mission we embark on in this first part with Sam, it's one that's even less substantial than escaping the police officer. All we need to do is make our way past the miner, grab a weapon that's up ahead, kill the shibito at the nearby shack, and make your way inside. These are out and out tutorial sections, so there's nothing truly amazing to see here, but at the very least, it still works in getting the player accustomed to the environment they're working with, as well as also the sneaking and combat systems. The latter of those are actually being less relevant in my opinion, purely because of how simplistic both these elements are. But of course, when it comes to the environments, as I discussed already, the overwhelming darkness of these is genuinely quite unconventional, even pointing to games like Outlast that put you in areas that are equally pitch black. You at least have the night vision mode on your camera that lights everything up nicely. In Blood Curse, all you've got is your flimsy flashlight that at points can be so ineffective that you'll be questioning if it's even turned on. After Sam gets ambushed by some unknown figure, we cut back to Howard, who ends up running into a woman called Amana.
Damn. Now what?
Are you alright?
You're one of them.
I'm glad we get the clarification from Howard that she's one of them, as even despite her ritualistic outfit, because of how difficult it is to make out anyone during that opening set piece, it wouldn't be a shock for players to have no idea who this woman is to begin with. It's in this mission where we learn about sightjacking, a mechanic that remains equally as impressive and unique as the instances of it we see in the previous games. Much like many elements featured in this game, however, it's been refined excellently, being a whole lot more functional and a whole lot more stylistic in my opinion. The sightjacking's now shown in the form of a split screen, with your point of view being pushed to the left and the shibitos popping up on the right whenever you lock onto one. The look of the screens are great, with the colour of the shibito's vision once again having this intensely grainy sepia tone to it, yet again adding to their otherworldly feel. When it comes to our screen, however, I love how the sightjacking's now painted out in the form of an eye that we can then use to navigate the scenery, with the outer edges of the screen showing the eyelids and the centre representing the pupil. That's where the functional improvements can also be appreciated. The addition of the split screen isn't for purely a stylistic purpose. Off the bat, it already gives the player more clarity on what's still going on around them while in this sightjacking mode. Because bear in mind, although I'd say the mechanic in the first game, for example, was made to feel even more necessary at points, it was also a bit more dangerous to use, considering we lose almost all sense of any threats that may be making their way towards us from an angle we aren't currently viewing. In all that, you would have heard me also describe how the sightjacking this time locks on to the shibito, and that's very much the case. Unlike before, where we had to move the analog stick in whatever direction the shibito were. We can now simply hit R1 or L1 to immediately lock on to any of the figures around each level. It doesn't matter how far away they are particularly, or if they're alive or dead. And as a result, this means that sightjacking was an even more appealing concept to me. I felt there was perhaps a bit too much confusion when it came to what we saw in the previous games. We're looking at a static screen to begin with, and then are only given the point of view of whichever character we're tapping into. In Blood Curse, we no longer have to search for them ourselves because of how we can lock on with a single button press, but as we've got additional visual elements on our side of the screen, like the bright red indicator that tells us what shibito we're looking at and where they're located, it once again adds clarity towards our actions, turning the mechanic into one that's even more effective to our ultimate progression. If you do want to emulate the older way of utilizing the sightjacking mode, however, that is still possible. It's no longer a case of navigating a static screen, but instead, by using the right analog stick, you can move the pupil to lock into the enemies yourself. A more drawn out process compared to simply tapping the triggers, obviously, but I still appreciate this is here. Adding to that, this whole split screen setup even allows us to do something almost entirely brand new, and that's how by tapping square when locked onto someone, you can now hold their vision on screen and freely move about. Now I say it's almost brand new, because we did actually see something similar in Siren 2, firstly with how we could lock a perspective on our screen. However, this still required you to enter the sightjacking mode to witness it. There were points where we could also move around while sightjacking, although that was only possible to do with the character Shu Mikami, who was essentially blind and had to use the vision from those around him to navigate. An excellent concept, I should add, turning the sightjacking mechanic into one that feels far more useful than most other points, to be honest. What we see in Blood Curse is a pure refinement of both elements. We can now hold the view on screen without having to be in the sightjacking mode, and additionally, we can perform other actions on our own screen alongside that. All things would point towards this being a full-on improvement. However, there's one big issue that ends up taken away from the sightjacking that could play a substantial role in how often someone chooses to utilize it in this way. For everything I've just talked about, it doesn't appear the game can really handle what it's trying to achieve. For those who play pretty much any kind of split-screen game on this generation of consoles, you can almost guarantee that you were going to witness some kind of performance drop due to the additional processing power that's now required. As a result, you found games that do things like minimizing the player's field of view or lowering the resolution to keep the performance in the realms of something that's actually playable. Blood Curse, though, doesn't appear to care at all about these kinds of optimizations, and in coming up with this nice concept of holding one screen on the right and continuing to play on the left, there seems to be no consideration given to how substantially the game's frame rate tanks. No matter what you're doing, I would describe it as almost unplayable. As if the frame rate issues weren't bad enough, there's also an additional blur effect placed on screen that only amplifies these issues even more, turning the entire screen into a jittery mess. So once again, in all these refinements we've been discussing, there's something here that's a great concept with poor execution. Overall though, an improvement on what we've seen before, I think. Sightjacking in general has remained a unique idea ever since the first game, and it's one that without a doubt is a defining characteristic of the Siren franchise. The refinements we do see only reinforce its identity even more by making it easier to use, with even more functions than it had before. The only issue, of course, is that while the characteristics from the past have been refined, these newer elements do have some issues of their own. Our mission with the man is another one that's entirely tutorial based, this time being all revolved around the sightjacking. Unlike the previous two levels we've experienced so far, however, the environment we're exploring is nowhere near as dark, giving us a nice opportunity to actually appreciate what we can see this time. Thankfully, due to how the game's been structured in a similar way to the previous entries, we do also end up seeing those prior areas at different times of day, so we'll talk about them more when we eventually get to them. As for this sunken village, however, this is where we can really start noticing the state of disrepair and the truly vile nature in which all this stuff is presented. Essentially all of the houses, shops and restaurants we can journey to are flooded, with this red water pouring in from the outside. The red water itself looks outright disgusting when it comes to all the muck and dirt we can see floating in it, but as we can see when journeying to the edge of the map, this isn't merely a matter of the intense rain creating this flood. We can also see the oceans turn this same red colour as well. Much like I feel with every area in the game, every structure we can observe from both the inside and out has that distinct rural Japanese feel. The way the environment's been constructed, the kinds of buildings we're seeing, and the layouts we can witness when making our way inside. All of these things bring a superb degree of authenticity that once again pushes someone like myself almost completely out of their comfort zone. You can see in pretty much all elements of the environment's design that we're far out from any other substantial human contact, making us feel even more isolated and like our plight to escape this nightmare is increasingly hopeless. It's all in the details for me. The signs we can see hung up outside nearby restaurants, the posters that are hung up on the walls, the carefully constructed rooms we're able to investigate. There seems to be such a huge huge amount of care, not only when it comes to how these structures are laid out, but from top to bottom. Authenticity is always the main thing that stood out for me. Every location I journey to throughout the game feels so genuine that the horror's only amplified to an even greater extent, whether it be a wrecked bedroom or a flooded store. Taking one look at the buildings in this area makes me immediately believe that people once used to live here, and that's the ultimate success in my opinion. Despite the over-the-top and ridiculous nature that encompasses much of the game's design, when it comes to the environments, these are oftentimes painstakingly realistic when it comes to what we observe in the village, and as a result of that, it makes the horrific events and the shibito we witness feel even more real, and even more terrifying as well. One final visual element I want to mention before we jump into the next episode is the skybox we're able to witness in this one. This is something else that carries across to most levels in the game, and to put it simply, I just think it looks phenomenal. Whether it be lighter or darker, clear or cloudy, this crimson red sky that we so oftentimes see throughout the game looks unbelievable to me, not only in how it illuminates our surroundings as well as the sky itself, but when looking even closer in a level like this, we can even see the reflections that are generated from the ocean as well. And while the lighting that's generated from these skyboxes will almost always be the highlight, I don't think the surrounding mountainous areas should be ignored either. Because of that intense contrast I talked about earlier, there's many times where no real distinguishable features can be seen, with everything we see surrounding these levels being presented like a pitch black silhouette. That's basically only ever a positive for me though, whether it be the rocky mountains, the trees, or the transmission towers we can see. The way in which these darker elements complement the lighting that's presented creates what I still consider some of the best background scenery I've ever witnessed in a video game. It's a similar feeling to how I perceive certain games released on the PS1 or 2. Even though the game still looks good, we're still not at the point technologically where genuine photorealism is achievable. But in a situation like this, because of how artistic I find these elements to be, they're far more appealing to me compared to any sort of outright realism that may have been presented in other instances. And once again, this is all coming from techniques I describe as being wholly cinematic. The film grain, distinct colours, intense lighting choices. Don't get me wrong, I still understand the complaints around these elements from a gameplay point of view, as we'll discuss even deeper in a second, but damn if it doesn't result in a game that still looks unbelievable. As for the mission itself, it's another one where we're simply sneaking throughout a level once again before eventually reaching the exit. As I say, the sightjacking's the main aspect that's getting focused on during this one, but towards the back end of the stage, we're also made to interact with two other gameplay elements, both of which seem interesting on the surface, but aren't too impactful in terms of the experience at large. The first is the interactable objects we can find around the environment, with the example that's shown off in this case being the sign we can push onto the shibito from the restaurant. As I say, a nice idea on the surface, but it's one that's not particularly utilised to any great degree outside of this introductory moment. The second gameplay element comes right at the end, where to bypass a shibito, we have to set up a trap and shout to draw its attention, where as you could assume, the shibito ends up getting stuck while walking towards us. Again, a seemingly good concept, but considering we're given access to weapons for the vast majority of the experience, there's very few times I thought these traps were actually practical. After leaving the area, we cut straight to a brand new perspective, this time showing the character Seigyo Saga, who seems to be engaging in a bit of shibito hunting. In these moments, we witness even more bizarre behaviour being shown off by the undead creatures, appearing to show an active awareness of the shotgun that's blasted at them, and trying to run for cover. Something else you might notice about the shibito we see here is that we've seen each of them in previous levels already. The police officer we obviously saw in the first level, the miner we saw in the one with Sam, and the woman in the middle could be seen during the level we just experienced. That's another strong aspect I've always associated with the Siren games, the reuse of these models, and how that helps in making even the most minor of shibitos stand out even more. The best part is, even if this was done purely from the point of view of not wanting to create tons of different variants of these guys, that doesn't really matter, because we found ourselves in a tiny rural village in Japan. There's no expectation of there being any great population out here anyways, so it makes sense in terms of the story, is beneficial when it comes to the resources during development that now could perhaps be applied elsewhere, and develops a familiarity with many of these to give them even more personality. And even when saying that, upon getting deeper into the game and seeing how these shibito eventually transform into even more twisted creatures, there could never really be any complaints of our enemies lacking any sort of variety. As for the characters we witness guess here, I already mentioned Seigo, who much like a mana, was able to be seen taking part in the ritual at the start. Additionally, however, we end up seeing the return of Miyako, one of the only characters from Siren 1 that actually makes a return. All the other characters here are obviously reimaginings of the characters in that game anyways, but Miyako's the only one that shows up relatively unchanged. Well, at least in terms of her character. Gameplay wise, she's made far less annoying, as we'll eventually see. Cutting back to Sam, we discover that mysterious figure who clocked him around the head was actually his ex-wife, Melissa. And if I'm being honest, this is probably the first mission I'd say that feels like a full-on waste of time. Let's just say that if I'd only paid for the bundle that contained episodes 1 to 4, I'd be feeling a bit ripped off with how episode 2 caps things off. The environment's exactly the same, with it still taking place in this pitch black mine where we can see hardly anything at all. There's no real development in terms of the story, and the only new mechanic we're really taught about is how we can press triangle on doors to stop the shibito from opening them. There are still some bizarre things to witness along the way, like how we stumble upon some shibitos that seem to be frantically dancing with each other, and there's also a very freaky moment we can experience on the bridge when these guys start dashing towards us out of the darkness, but it's too short and inconsequential to feel even remotely substantial. As for that door bracing, however, this will potentially be the first time in which the player will experience the motion control functionality in the game, something that I feel is given far too much importance if I'm being honest. In situations like bracing doors or reloading weapons like we see later in the level, it's not a massive problem because it's optional. You don't have to reload in this way, and you don't have to brace doors at any point to reach the end of any level. What you will find comes as a near mandatory form of these motion controls though, is when you get knocked onto the ground. Every time you get knocked over when getting hit by a shibito, something I should mention is quite common, you've got to shake your controller up and down to increase the speed in which your character gets up. And needless to say, I think it feels gimmicky and annoying, just like any game that utilizes motion controls in this way. I'm already not a fan of these to begin with, but to have them so closely tied to my survival at points was particularly frustrating. I get the intention, it's trying to draw you even more into the frantic experience playing out on screen. I just simply don't think it's worth the trade-off. I'm playing a third-person horror adventure game here, not Wii Sports. Wrapping up the episode, Amana seems to be taken away by some flying variant of the shibito, and after getting chased through a forest, the small girl Bella seems to find herself in some kind of hospital.
Daddy said they don't exist. They don't exist!
This is how we start episode 3 off. Now once again, as this is yet another concept that's being ripped straight from the first Siren game, I'll start by saying that much like all the brilliant ideas that return in Blood Curse from the previous games, I'm giving a good deal of praise to those previous incarnations on top of what we see purely in this game. With that being said, the idea of having to sneak our way through a grimy, shibito-ridden hospital has always been petrifying to me, and that still mostly persists every time I come back to the game, even with how we find ourselves inside a large building now. Because of how it seems that most lights are either broken or shut off, the environment's still equally dark as most areas up till now. However, as is shown off directly after we leave the initial room, placing us in these more enclosed surroundings ends up having a great side effect, and what I'm referring to is the particularly distinct imagery at points, which are solely created using lighting. The main thing you're made to feel when playing as Bella is pure vulnerability, exactly how it should be in my view. Unlike all the other characters who can fight back against the shibito, either by using their fists or the many weapons they can find around the environment, if you get caught as Bella, it's an instant game over, immediately presenting an additional fear that we haven't yet experienced, one that's related to our ultimate progression. Understand that outside the fear that's generated from things like the chilling atmosphere we're experiencing, there's always an additional tension when looking to the technical side of the game as well, most notably when it comes to the checkpoints. I compare it to playing on Veteran with the Call of Duty games. There's always certain missions that feature segments that can feel almost impossible, so when you find yourself on the very brink of progressing to the next checkpoint after so many failed attempts, you'll find your heart starts beating out of your chest, desperate to get over the line. That same stressful feeling very much applies to something like this. However, I'd say it's a more external factor that works to enhance the scares, compared to those COD missions where progression is the be and end all. And all this works brilliantly in Bella's mission here. I'd have to say it's one of my favourites in the entire game. To begin with, it's the first mission to not feature any tutorial segment, so that's already a positive. The character we're playing as not only appears entirely outmatched by the many shibito we run into along the way, but also is genuinely helpless in terms of how we combat them. Reason being, we can't really. If we get spotted, there's no way of fighting back, and due to Bella's running speed being noticeably slower than most other characters, you're also going to have a hard time escaping too. This in turn makes the shibito appear like an even more terrifying threat. Even though I still perceive them as creepy throughout the entirety of the game, I at least have the knowledge that most of the time I can whack them with a crowbar and have them out of action for a while. That option's completely gone with Bella, providing the brilliant result of making it so that every movement we make and the way in which we observe our environment and the shibito that wander around it is taken with even more care and attention from the player. Whereas in other cases, there was a greater chance for you to miss out on these opportunities. There's now times where you're quite literally forced to wait and take everything in while a shibito moves out the way. Even more odd behaviours can be observed from the shibito in this one, all of which relate once again to the strangely human characteristics they seem to have. These guys can talk, use equipment, use weapons, and with many of these nurses, we can see them getting on with what we can assume is their regular jobs, seeing one standing at reception desks, sitting down and attempting to do paperwork, all as they talk and laugh to themselves. I've mentioned the importance of Japanese culture several times at this point, and how it gives the series a particularly unique identity, and that very much applies to the dialogue we continually hear from these guys, both when they're passive and aggressive. This is something else that's always stood out to me with these games. Whereas there's many monsters in video games that have screams, growls, or speak to us directly in English, there's very few occasions where a zombie type figure like this is actually speaking a recognizable language, but simply one that I don't understand. It does make me wonder what the game's like for players who do understand Japanese, as the feeling of being a foreigner, both in terms of the characters we're controlling, as well as myself playing the game, has always been very integral towards the unique feel I've always garnered from Siren. There's a similar situation to be found in both Resi 4 and 5, with how the enemies in those games communicate in Spanish and Kiswahili. But when making those comparisons, I'm left appreciating how visceral the shibito's dialogue is, with them generating some utterly bizarre sounds at certain points. As well as having all the sounds they create feature this multi-layered audio pitched effect that makes their voices incredibly unsettling. The Japanese language and my own ability to not understand it is arguably the key to its success in my opinion though. As I say, that will vary depending on how familiar you are with the dialect, but needless to say, with what's shown off later in the level, I much prefer the unknown factor the Japanese presents compared to the shibito who talk in English. And what I'm mainly referring to here is our encounter with Sol Jackson, who appears at the entrance of the hospital.
Huh? Sol?
Bella! Bella! I found you! Now you're it!
No!
Sol appears to have become a shibito after assumedly getting killed by the ones in the forest, and the fear I've garnered from this guy mostly relates to who he is compared to what he does. Sol was essentially proof for me as to how important it is that I don't understand the shibito, because in pretty much all the occasions where he talks to us, I didn't find him to be even remotely as scary on his own.
Hey, don't run away. You, me, and Melissa will be one big happy family.
That's what I meant in regards to how Japanese players perceive the shibito. It's quite hard to gauge things like how good the voice acting of these characters are when you can't understand what they're actually saying. But let's say that in Sol's case, much of the bizarreness I feel from the other shibito in the game isn't present for me personally. His performance sounds over the top in a way that's not particularly convincing.
Hey baby, come on, don't be shy!
As I say, the main fear comes when thinking of who he is in relation to Bella herself. The idea of having someone coming after you that at one point was trying to protect you creeps the hell out of me. It makes us feel even more alone and even more likely to get killed. It should be said as well that despite the fear which I feel is dampened somewhat from his performance, there is still a great deal garnered from his behaviour when trying to make his way to us. Sol doesn't really act in the same way as the other shibito we've encountered so far. Most of them work off set routines, either staying confined to certain areas, performing individual actions, or walking around the levels on set paths. And while you'd say that Sol's arguably on an even more set trajectory compared to those, it's the speed he moves at and his ultimate objective that makes the ending of this level so damn scary. We know the shibito in most cases are just going about their business, where only upon spotting the player will they start chasing after us. Sol starts making his way towards us from the outside, being able to witness his frenzied behaviour, both by looking at him at the entrance and also by sightjacking. We can feel the aggression coming off his character, and we know we're in for for a very bad time if he ends up catching us, making him an even more freaky figure as we see him actively searching for a way inside the building, before climbing up and running back to the last place he saw us. It's desperation that's one of the most vital elements. There's such a determination when it comes to his want to kill us, that when paired up with things like his appearance, his previous relation towards Bella, and the claustrophobic environment we're placed in with almost nowhere to effectively hide, it all results in a conclusion that's superbly tense. One of my all-time scariest moments in a video game occurred during this final segment, and despite it happening so many years ago now, I still vividly remember it. When hiding from Sol in the incinerator down in the basement, I assumed I was safe after he'd passed by the room and started getting into the nearby elevator. However, when making my way out, I kicked a nearby object, and thus alerted him of my position. In a panic, I jumped back inside the incinerator, but was ultimately too late, and with Sol opening up the door, I was so frightened at the time that it remains quite literally the only time in a game where I paused, thought about it, and switched the game off. Perhaps you could argue it's because I was younger, or that everything lined up perfectly in that one scenario, but needless to say, that one example goes to show the raw fear I've always associated with this game. Moments like that are essentially unparalleled for me compared to almost every other horror game I've played. Yeah, there's been things that have likely made me jump more intensely, but the fact that I was made so terrified of a resulting outcome that ultimately is quite underwhelming when it comes to getting caught as Bella is a massive feat in my opinion. Remember though, what I'm discussing here is the potential this game has to create these scares. Not everyone will experience them to this same degree. Hell, outside that one situation all those years ago, I haven't managed to recapture that same level of fear in this mission either. But due to all the features I've mentioned so far, the enemies, the atmosphere, the sound design, Blood Curse always shows that it has the potential to absolutely terrify the player if all these match up. And I'd say in my case, they oftentimes do. Despite having a close encounter with Sol, Bella ends up escaping the hospital, in which after we see Sol himself escape and promptly attack Melissa, we cut back to Howard, who finds himself stumbling upon Miyako and Seigo.
Miyako-san. ご自分のお役目を忘れですか?
Yeah, Hanase!
Get your hands off of her!
また邪魔する気か?
Wait, you were part of that ritual!
That's how it's cursed, you know?
Once again, I feel the clarification from Howard here is almost necessary, as I don't imagine many people would have made the link between Seigo and the opening ritual, for the exact same reasons I mentioned with the manor. As for our mission in this one, it's yet another case of simply reaching an exit point in a separate part of the level. The difference in this case, however, is that we've now also got Miyako trailing behind us, turning the entire section into an escort mission. Now, I hate escort missions as much as the next person, and if I'm being completely honest, the ones we see in this game have all the hallmarks of missions that could be absurdly frustrating, depending on factors like how well you know the game's mechanics, and how well you know the design of the levels. At the very least, and now that we're back in the role of an adult, we can now defend ourselves once again, as well as also Miyako, so that's already a big help in our mission forward. The level itself is another one that's crawling with shibito. Additionally, however, it's also one that, despite occurring during a brighter time of day, is absolutely smothered in fog all the way throughout. The effect itself is fantastic. From the team that was behind Silent Hill 1, they once again prove how superbly they can implement these hazy environments that I've witnessed so many other games struggle with. And of course, it's not only a matter of looking great, but functionally, it also creates a greater opportunity for the player to get detected if they aren't taking their time and keeping an eye out for any shibito that may be lurking throughout this fog. Talking of them, we see even more in this area performing actions that you can imagine relate to their jobs or hobbies in real life. One of the first ones we encounter, for example, was the woman who appears to be gardening nearby a shed, and as we get later into the level, we even see others digging into the ground and outright communicating with each other. Yet some more examples of their human side shining through, which for me has always made the shibito even more scary because of the massive contrast that's presented from these actions and their appearances. As I say though, our ultimate objective is all based on navigation once again, with Miyako being the only thing that changes things up a little bit. And while she can be annoying to deal with at times, getting cut off and attacked by shibito in a way to slow your overall progress, I've never had too much of a problem, to be honest. I'd say that mainly comes back to another aspect you could potentially criticize, and that's how effective we are in combat. There's one point during this level where you're able to climb up a tree to more effectively reach an area with a weapon. Only issue is, the branch you use to jump onto the nearby ledge ends up snapping, temporarily separating you from Miyako. And while this is a blatant set piece, where Miyako will always get chased by a shibito and lock herself in a shed nearby, that separation's the only real issue you face when it comes to escort missions, not only in this game, but also in general. Luckily, Miyako doesn't find herself wandering too much from you, and even if you do find yourself separated in the scenario you run too far away from her, there's always the sight jacking that allows you to immediately identify where she is. Let's just say, I found this level a whole lot less frustrating compared to the one that it's emulating from Siren 1. In that game, Miyako's actually blind, and as that's reflected in the gameplay, you'll find that even if you venture off the smallest amount in front of her, there's a chance she'll end up losing you and just stand around till you come and collect her. Outside that, it's another level of taking out and bypassing Shibito. The environment's still great, with this level being one that we find ourselves returning to quite a few times in the future in different contexts. The highlight for me once again coming from the surrounding background scenery, with the blood red sky, dark mountains and transmission tower that overlook the area we find ourselves in. But something else that's excellent here, and excellent for the vast majority of the game, is the music we hear playing throughout. The soundtrack for Blood Curse might be one of my favourites in any horror game I've ever played, and like I've mentioned in the past, this isn't solely based on the quality of the tracks themselves, despite that obviously being a very important aspect. It's all about how they match up with what we're witnessing on screen. Using this level as an example, the track we hear in the back is a bit tamer compared to some of the others we hear. There's two main characteristics of this one that stand out to me, and that's the lower notes we hear that match up perfectly with the grimy, almost swampy environment we're exploring, and also the higher notes that emulate the siren we're all too familiar with. Both of these fit in line with what we've been experiencing so far in the game already, but even when looking from a more individual context in terms of this sole level, you could argue these peaks and troughs we're hearing could be emulated perfectly when it comes to our quiet navigation in this isolating fog, as well as the shocking discovery of the shibito we run into several times. The soundtracks for the earlier games were fantastic as well, but with Blood Curse, I found there were a bunch of tracks here that had a real groove to them, whereas there are plenty that stay in line with the same industrial drones that we heard in the first couple games. There's also others, like Retribution, that have this greater focus on the drums and percussion, resulting in a piece of music that's great to listen to even outside the games. I am a big fan of the more ambient tracks as well, of course, with there being no real instances where I found any of these to be particularly out of place. The only thing you could potentially argue is somewhat over the top are some of the tracks which play during the action set pieces. Tracks like Tension, for example, are very overt in what they're trying to convey. But again, as long as they work with what we're seeing, which I think they do, I don't have any real issue, especially when it comes to tracks like New Revelation Anxiety or Undercover, despite the two tracks seeming to strive for something different in a musical sense. The creepiness and otherworldly nature I feel both of them generate makes them excel to a great degree. So the soundtrack's a massive success in my opinion. Blood Curse not only finds itself bringing back memorable tunes from the past, like the main theme, and putting a new spin on them, but what we hear when actually playing the game makes the experience even more unsettling than it otherwise would be. Never being too overwhelming, but almost always being present and noticeable. Reaching the end of the episode, we cut to a manor, where it's shown that whatever objective it is she's trying to pursue is all to appease some kind of god that she's requesting guidance from.
Please, God. Tell me what I must do next.
The next episode starts off by having us play as Seigo, having to protect and locate Sam, who somehow found himself here. That's a part of the game that's never particularly explained. There's quite a few times where for some reason, characters just separate from each other, despite that ultimately being against their best interest. With Sam, for example, even though staying with Melissa would be the much better and safer option, he's just gone off on his own. Are we meant to believe that after his headache, Melissa just ran off without him? It doesn't make much sense. Either way, it does open the opportunity for some more unique partnerships, Sam and Seigo being one of them. In this mission, we find ourselves back in the same housing settlement that we explored previously with Amanda and Howard, and despite the objective here being equally as unremarkable, simply having to find Sam and get out the area, we can notice differences when it comes to the environment and the shibito that still keeps things fresh. First off, outside of one mission that comes towards the end of the game, I never really associate any real horror with Seigo's levels, mainly because whenever we play as him, we always start off with a double-barreled shotgun that also has a large pool of ammo. That means that any shibito you come across can be dealt with incredibly easily, which as a result also means there's no real depth to his stages either. You're not having to rely on sneaking or sightjacking at any point. These are missions that you can brute force with absolute ease. I would be lying if I didn't say the power trip wasn't fun though, especially because of how the shibito do remain a prevalent threat before and after this mission. Talking of the environment, this is the first case where we see the times of day are being used effectively to generate a different kind of atmosphere and different kinds of scenery. Whereas the last time we were here, the area was categorized with the crimson red sky and dark surroundings, now the area is noticeably brighter, but this time having a very thick fog coating the area. A great example of resource management, keeping things fresh while still ultimately working with the exact same framework. And this also applies to the new type of shibito we discover here, and it's one that's been hinted at several times on the run up to this mission. Much like many of the other types we discover throughout the game, I love how there's no grand reveal to this thing. The first time we see it is from our own perspective, resulting in a moment that will likely be even more unexpected and shocking. The new type that we see here are known as the fly shibito, with their designs appearing even more grotesque compared to the ones we've seen already. And to put it simply, they're shibitos that, for some reason, have developed the characteristics of a fly, having large wings sticking out of their head, which they use to fly around, as well as having their postures more closely emulate a fly as well. Why they've suddenly been able to metamorphosize and take on traits from insects like this, I have no real idea. As we'll eventually see, there is a link between the creatures these shibito transform into, but there's no absolute reason given as to how and why this happens exactly. Either way, they're a fantastic new addition, although I will say, outside the ones which carry firearms later on, the way they function isn't all that different to a regular shibito. The only difference is the way in which they attack, being able to pick the player up, in which we once again have to shake our controller to release ourselves. Outside that, we attack them the same way, and they attack us the same too. Keep what I said about how these are revealed in mind, however, as this applies greatly to a few of the shibito brains we discover later on, that thrive even more off this approach. With the fly shibito, we at least got the setup in previous episodes from the encounters that were hinted at off screen. With some of these other types, they quite literally show up with no indication whatsoever, presenting even more shocking situations. As for the environment, while there's not much to add, considering it is literally the exact same area we've explored before, I'm happy we've got those minor visual changes to keep the look of the place even more engaging. Much like most other areas we get to explore throughout the game, the layout of it is a bit different to how these types of linear games usually convey their levels. Typically, it's all a matter of progression. You go from one environment straight into the next. And while you could say this applies when it comes to jumping from mission to mission, the environments in the Siren games have always been quite open. It's not a matter of going from A to B and then being unable to return to A like many other games do. The level's entirely open for you to explore. Even after you find Sam, for example, there's nothing stopping you from climbing back up the tower you started in. It presents a nice deal of freedom. While the graveyard section of this place isn't all that useful to observe in this particular mission, we can still journey to it and likely encounter shibito along the way. That second part's also something I appreciate quite a bit. There's plenty more missions throughout the game that feature areas that, just like here, aren't utilised for certain missions, despite them still being accessible. However, the environment's made to feel equally believable regardless because of how there's brand new shibito still getting placed in these areas. It feels like there's consideration being given to details that are ultimately unimportant, and I think that's great. It presents an experience that feels even more carefully constructed than it already is. The next mission shows the continued progression of Howard and Miyako, now finding themselves in a section of Hanuda referred to as Tabori, and arriving at a settlement inhabited by the Ito family. This is yet another level that, from the outside at least, is just unbelievably dark. Turn your flashlight off and try to find your way forward. It's damn near impossible if you aren't already familiar with the level, and even then it's still pretty hard. The sound design's something that stands out to me for most of this one, cutting out all the music that we've been used to hearing throughout each stage so far, and having almost the entire ambience be made up of the siren that constantly plays in the distance. Even when we eventually make our way inside the house, the siren still remains the focal point in the audio department. The sound design in general is something that I'm rather mixed on with this game, with parts of it absolutely excelling, and other parts being surprisingly underwhelming. We've already discussed many of the aspects I think are great, the wonderfully twisted sounds of the shibitos, with there being a surprising amount of variation when it comes to things like what type we're encountering, if they're male or female, or if they're one of the more unique brains we can eventually find. As we can hear in a stage like this, the general ambience of each level is something that I also think shines when it's given a chance to, hearing the sounds of the sirens and the blood rain pouring onto the ground. And of course, as we just talked about, the music is excellent from start to finish. However, there are some really strange areas where the game falters for me in the audio department, and that mainly relates to the weaponry and the impact they create when using them. For all the gross squelching sounds we hear the shibito generate themselves, when smashing them in the face with a hammer or a sickle, there's not a great deal of feedback generated, with the same going for when they hit us as well. When hitting someone with a sledgehammer, for example, it actually sounds more like you're hitting a solid piece of wood compared to a fleshy monster. The same goes for the firearms in my opinion, with the pistol, hunting rifle and shotgun lacking a certain amount of weight and bassiness that would have created more of an impact. If you're including combat in your games, these are pretty fundamental things you need to consider, much like how I find it satisfying to sneak past a shibito and watch them pass by a closet I'm hiding inside. I would also expect that to apply to this separate way of approaching these encounters. And in terms of the combat, not only do I feel that's not particularly met in the audio department, but also the mechanics of it as well. My main problem is that it's as bare bones as can be, which I imagine will also result in it appearing rather clunky for many players too. You press one button when fighting with melee weapons, and two when you've got a firearm, those being L1 and R1. There's no form of defending. Once you decide to fight a shibito, you either whack or shoot these guys until they fall to the ground. There's no depth whatsoever to the combat system, and don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting Devil May Cry here. I get that not a huge amount of depth has been implemented, because running around and smashing the shibito's faces in isn't the ideal way of experiencing the game at large, but if it's here, it needs to be judged on its own merits. And when it comes down to it, combat encounters on the whole are predominantly clunky, especially when using melee weapons. Everything plays out via a lock-on system, much like the original Siren games. So once the game establishes who you're targeting, which 9 times out of 10 it does effectively, you can just wail on this target until you knock them out. There are times though where you may not lock onto them and end up swinging right past them, or you perhaps make a movement that makes them miss their swing at you as well. And it's in that period where the clunkiness is mainly shown off, having to slowly turn your character around to get eyes on the shibito again, in which the shibito itself may have already turned around faster than you and started attacking. Add in factors like the pitch black darkness we're so oftentimes surrounded by, the annoying motion controls we might have to engage with if we get grabbed, and encounters can become very awkward. Nothing awful once again, nothing I ever found myself genuinely frustrated by, unlike what I experienced in the earlier games, but just not as functional as I would have liked. Even the addition of a quick turn, or simply the ability to rotate your character faster, would alleviate some of these issues in combat, but that's more of a camera problem compared to anything else, something else we'll discuss later on I have mostly positive things to say about. Anyways, as you might have already assumed, the objective here is the same one we've had several times now. Simply navigate your way to an exit, although with the additional interior section we're made to make our way through here, there is a bit more depth. Miyako still remains by our side, but with the area we travel being far less, and with us still being able to protect her easily during combat, there's even less of a problem in regards to the whole escort mission side of things. One thing that can be particularly effective during this mission are the sub-commands we can activate with the D-pad. This is another aspect of the game I find to be fairly underutilized for the vast majority of it, which is actually a bit of a shame in this case, as in this horror context, I do think it holds great potential. It's basically a refined version of what the triangle button did in the previous games, a quick fire way of either turning your flashlight on and off, shouting to the shibito, or commanding whoever's following you. This can be particularly effective in a mission like this. As the area is relatively small, there's no real issue in regards to how far we need to track back to go and collect Miyako from a hiding spot, meaning that for the endurance of our time in the house, we can tell her to hide in one of these spots, deal with everything on her own, and then bring her out when it's time to leave, reducing any risk of her getting caught up during any encounters we might have. While simple, the mechanic itself isn't the issue. I'm fine with the extent of these commands, even despite the number of them being quite limited. It's more a matter of how infrequently they're utilised, which I find a bit of a shame. Outside this one moment, for example, there were very few times in which I was telling my partner to hide somewhere, or wait in a position for a while, with this mainly coming back to the scenarios we're placed in, as well as how effective we are in combat. Especially if you're just playing on normal, there's hardly ever a reason to have someone wait while you clear a path forward. Because the combat encounters are oftentimes over in a matter of seconds, you may actually find it's more dangerous for them to be separated from you in the event another shibito comes to attack them when you're further away. Not to mention, it also leaves a greater opportunity for you to forget they aren't following you, which obviously could result in some annoying backtracking. To be honest, while I wouldn't describe them as being outright useless, if the hiding spots that are scattered throughout the game were just a bit more plentiful and a bit more practical, that potential would have a much greater chance of getting capitalized on. As it stands though, the commands on the D-pad, while being a definite refinement, still remain a bit too irrelevant for me to truly appreciate. Moving on to the next mission, Melissa finds herself arriving at Saiga Hospital in search of Bella, someone who we now assume has gotten crushed by a tree in the cutscene leading up to this one. Now, for what this mission may lack in terms of gameplay variety once again, it is somewhat alleviated with the appearance of yet another type of shibito, this time coming in the form of the spider shibito. In terms of appearance, these guys are debatably even more disgusting compared to the flies. The shibito's body is now shown to be extremely contorted, with many of their body parts appearing entirely inverted, as well as having what appears to be this huge bulbous mass that's protruding from their stomach area. A fantastic design, and a concept that, much like the flies, has been translated directly from the earlier titles. In terms of their functionality, I'd say these are arguably the most diverse foe when it comes to the common threats we come up against throughout the game. Despite their only form of attacking coming from the physical hits we receive from them, it's more a matter of how we avoid or attack them, which is our biggest issue. While they don't feature 8 legs, the spider shibito can very much still climb up on the walls and ceilings, presenting a scenario somewhat similar to the flies, where they can be much more difficult to attack at points, especially when aiming with something like a shotgun. That's already good, as it not only can nullify the effectiveness of essentially all the melee weapons for a brief period, but it also provides an additional obstacle when using such powerful weaponry as a firearm. Miss those 2 shotgun blasts, for example, when what would have otherwise have been a dead spider is now one that's pouncing on you. Visually, that side of things is great as well, presenting even more variety when it comes to how the shibito appear and how they navigate these environments, while also presenting a potential threat when it comes to actively spotting them. Because all these areas are so dark and cramped, there's quite a big chance you could find yourself getting tackled to the ground by one that you miss crawling on a ceiling above. The only real indication you receive outside of seeing them yourself are the brief orangey distortions that flash on screen whenever any shibito detects us, as well as obviously the bright red sight jacking screen that also pops up. However, the final big problem these guys can present us is in relation to the size and speed. Because of how significantly their bodies are contorted, they become a much smaller target to hit, so much so that I found there were quite a few instances where I even missed them when using the mostly reliable melee weapons which lock on to these targets. On top of that, because of the camera angle we're given throughout the game, there's also many occasions where if one of these guys runs towards you, they can find themselves almost disappearing off screen if you aren't actively moving your camera down. What others may find somewhat annoying, I find makes encounters even more tense. And not to mention, with their already vile appearance paired up with the increased speed they crawl towards us, the spiders are a foe that I've always found spine-tingling, even when they aren't darting towards us. Outside that, the best thing I think this level does is make greater use of the sight jacking, something that, as I've said, unfortunately is given less overall importance in my opinion. This comes in the form of 2 moments that help us in progressing forward. The first is one that's a bit more optional, having a sight jack into a spider that's looking at a key on a hospital bed, with this key giving us access to our ultimate goal of the roof. This is already a nice idea, with it working in some ways to set up the subsequent moment that occurs shortly after this one. The only difference between the two is that compared to here, where we could ultimately find and pick up the key without sight jacking, the second occurrence is mandatory to progress forward. Well, unless you played the game before, or search up the answer online. This comes about when making our way up to the rooftop, observing both Seigo and Sam making their way into a nearby building. All we need to do to complete our mission is to get in contact with them, and as we can see from our objective, we need to do this by calling them on a telephone. Now taking one look at those objectives, you can see immediately that much like all the previous stages, how much more thought's gone into giving the player a good level of guidance compared to the previous games. On the whole, I am much happier with this approach, and find it lands in a near perfect in-between at almost all times. Don't get me wrong, we had the objectives in the earlier games too, it's just the fact that instead of here, where we're told call from the phone in the surgery prep room, back then it would have just been find a phone. Adding even more to this guidance, with the map screen that returns here, which I find to already be improved in itself. We now also have numbered icons that directly connect to our objectives, so if you're unclear where the surgery prep room is, you can look at the map, check out all the separate floors, and eventually find the icon. I perceive this part of our guidance as perfection. Depending on how unfamiliar you are with these levels, they can occasionally seem like a labyrinth at points, which is made about 10 times worse from the fact they're so dark as well. So unlike other instances where I personally appreciate games that predominantly use the environment to naturally guide the player towards these objectives, I can see how there's almost a trade-off between the realism of these and how they work in terms of our progression. Because I'll admit, there's almost nothing in these environments that can help you progress forward, outside of quite literally just arriving in a place you were supposed to be. There's not really any of those lighting cues or breadcrumb trails which many other games use. With that being said though, because the map in this game isn't a case of simply setting a waypoint and immediately knowing where your destination lies, there's a whole new element garnered that I find equally enjoyable, using the map screen in conjunction with the environment I'm exploring and using my own intuition to go from point A to point B. The key here is the location. I'm told where I need to be heading, but not how I should be getting there, and I feel too many games step too far in the direction of guiding the player and decide to simply give them both these elements, when I think that ultimately lessens the experience. The fact that newer players won't know exactly where to go makes other potential issues I brought up previously seem far more irrelevant. For example, the ease of which we can deal with shibito in combat could entirely disappear if we spend a while trying to progress forward to attract the attention of multiple shibito at once and can't defend ourselves effectively. So for the game at large, I'm very happy with this approach, especially when given how difficult it was to find the correct way forward in the past games. The only small nitpick I have with this moment is that it's one of the few times where I feel a bit too much guidance is given, unfortunately, and that's in relation to the whole phone concept that wraps up the mission. Essentially, upon sightjacking into Seigo's point of view, we witness a small interaction between him and Sam, which I should add is already great, before then subsequently having Seigo walk over to the phone in their room, and thus having the room number revealed, which we then need to call. The only problem I have here, we're actively told this is what we need to do from the objective. What could have been a nice discovery that the player could find for themselves, showing the importance of the sightjacking and encouraging even further use of it in the future, is told to the player right from the off, thus having almost the opposite effect in my opinion. Players could get stuck by making the objective more obscure, so it might sound slightly hypocritical considering everything I've just talked about in regards to giving the player a bit more guidance and clarity. But again, telling the player exactly what they need to do essentially removes any kind of puzzle aspect that was clearly trying to be achieved at this point. Not a huge deal, and it's still a nice idea even when witnessing it play out in this way. Just something I wanted to point out as being somewhat of a missed opportunity in my opinion. Before we go and ring up Sam and Seigo, however, there is one more shock we're made to suffer on our way to the phone, and that's our first look at one of the shibito brains. I'd say this does a great job in setting the standard for these utterly abominable figures, where much like I think all the shibito do here, the brains on the whole live up to and ultimately exceed the brains we saw in the previous games. Their function's identical, cropping up typically around the back end of each level, and acting as a sort of hive mind. Upon tracking down and taking out the brain, all the shibito that are associated with it also get knocked out, which in this brain's case applies to the spiders. And for as much as I love the brains from a stylistic point of view, with us having to realise that at one point in time, this octopus-like mess in a wheelchair was once a human being, their placement has always been quite confusing. I've always personally found myself tracking them down and taking them out purely because I wanted to see the appearance of them all, but especially in a case like this, it really does feel quite optional. The point in which it shows up, much like most of these, is right near the end of the level, which as a result makes the overall impact of taking them out rather negligible, considering how close we are to leaving the stage anyways. But additionally, the detour you have to make here is actually more substantial substantial compared to simply heading straight for the phone. Bear in mind, there's only a couple spiders we need to deal with in between, which, if you've got a weapon, shouldn't be a huge problem to deal with, so we don't even particularly get a massive advantage when taken out anyways. This isn't the case for all the brains we see, luckily, with some of these creating more of an impact to the gameplay when appearing earlier in the stage, but they are placed in some odd places with many of these, always looking great, but not affecting things as much as I would have hoped. Meeting up with Sam and Seigo, the group part ways, with Seigo exclaiming that he's getting tired before blowing his brains out with a shotgun.
さすがに飽きた。
A very sudden decision, and one that he makes with seemingly no hesitation. We'll see why this is very shortly, however, as it seems Seigo was already assured that a shotgun blow to the head won't mean the end of his existence quite yet. Arriving back at the housing settlement, we're now placed in the role of a manor for the first and only time in the game. I perceive this stage as one of my favourites when it comes to the many different mechanics we're made to interact with all the way throughout, as well as also the manner in which we're ultimately made to progress. The level starts off by giving us a tailing mission, requiring us to follow the shibito that's holding the brooch that a man is looking for, already promoting the idea of being patient and taking our time with the stealth gameplay, which as a result had me particularly engaged with the scenario, as well as really taking in some of the scenery I was seeing and the music that was being played as I waited for the shibito to move forward. The shibitos eventually end up making their way down to some kind of shrine, in which we need to eliminate them all before reacquiring the brooch. This is another case where I could have perhaps done without the sub-goal. Telling us to throw a signal flare into the well not only gives the game away slightly on how we can most effectively progress, but equally, I think many players would have discovered this approach by themselves anyways. However, that's not too much of an issue ultimately, as after doing this, there's no other pieces of guidance given. It's up to you to go and take out the shibito down there, with the flare simply working as a smokescreen, so you can perhaps take out a couple without them all swarming you at once. Might sound simple on the surface, but it does require the player to use a good deal of speed and their own intuition to get the full effect of this flare. Take too long getting down there, and you'll have the shibito all coming after you once again. Arrive down there without a viable weapon, and you might get overpowered. What I particularly enjoyed about this is how it made what initially seemed like a very linear level, much like most of the ones we see here, open up a little bit. For example, in my first attempt at this, I thought I'd be able to use the flare, pick up the brooch, and run right back out. But when being given the knowledge I had to actually eliminate these guys, when restarting the stage, I immediately found myself deferring from the linear route I'd been on previously, heading into the restaurant nearby, that ultimately remains pretty irrelevant for the entire stage, to go hunt down a weapon, which I did end up finding. What I'm praising here are gameplay opportunities that I may have initially missed, now being showcased with the different approach I was taking. It's kind of like what I mentioned earlier about the placement of the shibitos, and how they can make the environment feel even more alive. Despite being ultimately irrelevant to this individual level, I don't arrive at the restaurant to find no weapons and no shibito. I find exactly what I was searching for in terms of a sturdy weapon, and additionally have to deal with a shibito that finds himself here, either by sneaking past them or knocking them out. As I say, what seemed like a mission with one sole goal has now become one where the self-imposed goal of getting in and out of the restaurant safely is presented. After picking up the brooch, a man is given a graphic vision, presumably from the god she's adhering to, of what seems to be someone eating some raw, fleshy matter. At least that's what's garnered from the nasty visuals we see on screen, and the disgusting sounds we hear. And judging from how we're immediately informed of the parasite concept when being given back control, it's fair to say that vision was more than likely a memory of a manners. Parasite was yet another concept we saw in the previous games, utilising the sight jacking ability in particular areas to find clues that will help us progress forward. This is one of those things that could have been very annoying to deal with, as I somewhat found was the case with the instances we saw before, but due to the ultimate placement of these parasite locations, the player shouldn't have a particularly hard time discovering them. For example, the first one we encounter is placed directly on our way to the exit of the house. It's quite literally unavoidable. Upon finding this clue, we're then given a sub-goal, guiding us towards the next parasite spot. So overall, it's handled quite well in terms of not having the player become entirely lost. From what I experienced in Siren 2, for example, there's a level quite early on where we need to find a key by searching for these same parasite spots. However, not only aren't they placed directly in the player's pathways, like we see in Blood Curse, but the guidance we're ultimately given was a bit too cryptic for my liking. We find the key in a wardrobe that contains a toy robot. Getting a vision simply of that robot doesn't really help us in finding it. From this clue, we're led towards a graveyard, using the name we were given to find the correct grave, and discovering a seal inside when opening it up. This ties into the final sightjacking moment that takes us out the level, having a lock onto a gateway that works as our exit to see what symbols we need to input into these seals, the first being found in this grave and the other being back down in the shrine area. Nothing too complex obviously, but these are puzzle elements that once again require you to utilise the game's core mechanics with your own intuition. Unlike the previous stage where we're told to sightjack and to say go to get the phone number, it's up to the player to utilise it effectively and make the link between the signs we see on the gateway and how we need to replicate them with the seals we discover. A great level from start to finish in my opinion. As I say, the main thing I admire about this one is how many elements of the game are getting highlighted to the player, all in a manner that feels more natural and less handholdy. It's also a change of pace somewhat from many of the levels we've tackled so far. Using the missions that take place in this exact same area as an example, what's our ultimate objective been both times? Follow a manor to reach an exit and collect sand before reaching another exit. This time our way of exiting's blocked off, thus putting a bigger emphasis on our exploration of the area and the way in which we observe and interact with it. There's more of a process towards the completion of this one, giving the level a bit more depth, and when you pair that up with the even more creative use of the sightjacking ability in this one, I once again have to appreciate the fact that we've returned to an area for the third time now and still have an experience that remains fresh for me, something which I also feel applies to most other locations too. With that, we reach the end of episode 5, getting a few interesting revelations before moving on to the next one. Sam and Melissa appear to still be on the search for Bella, however, Bella herself is shown to be alive and well, walking away from the broken tree that we initially assumed had crushed her. However, the pool of blood that sits nearby gives a subtle hint of what's really going on here. As for Amana, she showcases somewhat of a link between her and the shibito, as when arriving at what seems to be another ritual area, all the shibito behind her don't seem to show any sign of aggression, with no ambition of attacking. And as for Howard and Miyako, aside from another phenomenal visual that's presented, with these strands of light falling from the sky, Miyako ends up getting shot, which is exactly where we pick up from in the next mission. With Miyako somehow surviving a full-on shotgun blast to the abdomen, Howard sets about trying to find the perpetrator. He first attempts to knock him out with a minecart nearby, which is our only way of actually getting close to the mine this time without getting shot and killed. And upon jumping inside the car, we get a horrendously creepy glimpse at the shooter, who ends up dodging out the way of the track. And wouldn't you know, it's our old friend Seigo who's back as a shibito. Yet another concept which returns that I'm a very big fan of, being able to witness the characters we personally interact with and play as in the form of a shibito. And trust me, things only get worse for some of the other characters we witness in the near future. The format here is back to usual, one sole objective, that being to eliminate Seigo this time, and a few hurdles we need to deal with along the way to complete it effectively. Upon returning to the mines this time, however, we're given access to the underground tunnels, with there being several layers to deal with, all of which have weaving designs, with many different pathways, dead ends, as well as ascending and descending routes. And for those who've struggled with some of the tight, dark areas we've been exploring up to this point, this will appear like a bit of a nightmare if I'm being honest. As per usual, I still find what we can see, and the atmosphere that's generated from the environments and the soundtrack to be ace. But we've got that recurring issue of simply how dark everything is. Something I'd describe as being even more of a problem in this case, because of how the level's been designed. If it's already quite tough to figure out a way forward when working on a flat plane, upping the pathways and separate layers we're working with only makes our navigation even more tricky. Because bear in mind, even looking to our map screen now is more complicated than normal, purely because of how many different levels we're having to switch between. Even for someone like me, who's very familiar with these stages, I can very much see while playing how another player could become incredibly confused by what's being presented. With that being said, if we're talking about the horror that's generated from this place, that side is just as effective as always. For what the darkness and claustrophobia might present in terms of a lack of clarity, is made up for immensely when it comes to many of the spider shibito we encounter down here. Not to mention when we get eyes on Seigo, as well as the brain in this level. The first of which presenting a very unnerving visual of Seigo waiting for us to climb up the nearby ladder in pitch black darkness, and the other showing another monstrous transformation of a shibito, with this one seeming to have these large centipede-like tentacles bursting out of its body and attaching themselves to the ceiling. I think it's important to say that as someone who's played this game many times already, I always find myself actively searching for these occurrences every time I come back to a stage like this, which for me simply goes to show how much of a profound effect these things can create, at least in my personal case. I knew the most effective route before the stage had already begun. Drop down to a lower layer of the mines, collect a key, activate the siren, and take out Seigo. It's these oftentimes brief moments of absolute fear that I always find myself returning to though, and I'm not sure there's many other horror games that draw this level of intrigue or interest out of me. I'm making active diversions from the main objective, purely because there's something else, a mere visual we see in a level, that simply makes my experience feel even more worthwhile, and that is impressive to me. When a game's got me climbing up a ladder and staring at a figure just because of how good I find the visual to be, I find that a major success, especially coming from someone who's returned to this game very frequently throughout the years since I first played it. I never find moments like this getting old whatsoever. While I do feel more equipped nowadays, I should also mention how tense the end of this stage used to be, and still is to some degree. Upon activating the siren, Seigo immediately enters into a frenzy and starts running up to the surface, in which we're essentially made to just sit and wait for him to arrive so we can blast him in the face. And even when using the sight jacking to track his movements, the moments in which we wait for his arrival are beyond tense, especially if you've been killed by him previously in this level. You know you're only 1 or 2 shotgun blasts away from death, presenting a sizable threat as well. One thing I want to just briefly mention before moving on, however, is another element I feel had great potential that once again never got capitalised on. When collecting the shotgun earlier in the mission, we can actually head to one of the work tables in the power room on our way to the mines and modify it, sawing off the barrel of our shotgun and now giving us a weapon that now has the same kind of lock-on system as something like the pistol.
Alright, now we're talking.
Strangely, this is pretty much the only instance in which we can do something like this, only being able to repeat this same process in a later mission at the mines, once again only with a shotgun. I thought it would have been nice to perhaps see this translated to some of the other firearms too, or maybe even certain melee weapons to broaden out the variety of the weapons arsenal even further. Bear in mind, the game I most associate with this style of weapon modification are the Dead Rising games, and the one which introduced that system, that being Dead Rising 2, wasn't even out yet. So while it's not hugely innovative or expansive to any degree, it is a bit odd to only have it apply to one weapon throughout the game, especially when given the fairly broad arsenal that could have had the potential to feature even more modifications. Heading into the final mission of this episode, we take back control of Bella, where pretty much right from the off, we can feel something's not quite right. Compared to all the other scenes we've been witnessing prior to this one, there's a clear increase in terms of the glow and saturation that's applied to everything. Additionally, when looking at our surroundings, they become even more mystical than they had been previously. The darkness and fog we're so used to in these levels seems to have disappeared, especially in regards to the latter of those. This is likely the clearest we've been able to see in a stage so far, and when journeying forward, we can also observe many of these pixie-like figures floating in the air. Nothing here feels like it matches up with what we previously experienced, which is especially odd considering we're returning to an area we've already explored. This switch up in style starts getting explained more blatantly, however, when encountering the shibito in this area. Unlike every other time we've run into these guys, they act entirely passive towards Bella. They don't try to attack us, and they hardly even recognise our presence. Given what we saw earlier with Bella and the fallen tree, it's already pretty obvious what's going on. And while we get the reveal in the cutscene that caps off the mission, I do still enjoy this level from the pure fact that we're invincible. This one gives you a great opportunity to get right up close with the shibito, and observe every horrific detail when it comes to their designs. And I expect for players who become aware they're at no threat of getting caught this time, they'll be wandering right up to the other bizarre brain we can find here, with this one resembling a giant maggot. Another design here that I find to be superbly gross and spectacularly original. When eventually making our way to the church, however, it's revealed that throughout the entire mission, we've actually been playing as a shibito version of Bella, now giving us an insight as to what it is all the other shibito are likely seeing as well.
Melissa, don't!
In a way, it makes their situation even more tragic. The implication here is that they're entirely unaware of the state they've actually found themselves in, being trapped in some kind of purgatory, with their reality being merged between the one experienced by the humans and the one that's experienced by the other shibito. Entering episode 7, we find ourselves back in Howard's perspective, and as we'll eventually see, not only do we play as Howard for the endurance of this one, but it's also the final episode that relates to the initial timeline, with the idea of these different timelines we observe being something I'll discuss in a second. end. After getting separated from Miyako after Amana set him on fire, he ends up pursuing her, ultimately arriving at a place referred to as the Shibito nest. And as we can see when making our way into it, the idea of this being an insect-like nest is very much backed up with how the place has been designed. The nest is a massive structure that's been built by the Shibito to appease this god we've been hearing about. The siren we've been hearing throughout the game is one that's being generated from this god, serving not only as its way of screaming, but also being a call to action. It's this siren that essentially commanded the Shibito to construct this place. And as I say, from the very unconventional design we witness, we can very much feel how this place has been pieced together with basically anything they could get their hands on. Doorways that lead to nowhere, walkways made out of broken metal and loose wooden pallets. The fact this place is being described as a nest only makes it feel even worse. It gives us the feeling that this place is a hub of sorts, a place that's absolutely crawling with shibito of all kinds. Once again, there's something uncanny about what we witness, which is why I find the environment here so excellent. It's not so unusual to where the nest is being made out of materials we've never seen before, but the inherent design is just so unnatural that it makes us feel even more unsettled. Stepping out from a normal looking room, for example, only to be met with an immediate drop onto a platform outside made of scrap metal. We can feel the Shibito's handiwork all over this place, making us feel even more out of our comfort zone and out of our depth. Now, I've discussed the camera system in the game already, and while it's not perfect, I don't have too many real issues with it. The standard angle we have is akin to your typical over-the-shoulder third-person perspective that many games have used before. There is a nice cinematic element to this one, having the camera zoom in and out depending on factors like how tight the environment we're exploring is and what speed we're moving at. A nice dynamic element, but as I say, nothing really all that special. Unlike many others, however, there seems to be a trade-off that's given towards having this more dynamic system, in that when moving the camera about with our right analog stick, the area that's revealed only remains on screen for as long as we're holding in that direction. So for example, whereas in a game like GTA where you turn the camera around and see the front of your character, not only does the camera here not stay in that position when letting go of the analog stick, but we're also only able to view what's directly in front of us. A good decision ultimately, but as much like some of the other restrictions I've discussed, it leaves a greater opportunity for scares to be created during the gameplay. If you hear a noise from behind you, for example, it's not a matter of quickly spinning the camera around to see if anything's there. You instead need to actively turn your character, which is a much slower process, leaving you open for a potential fright once you've turned right round. I will say though, it can be slightly awkward given how restrictive it actually is. There's many occasions, for example, where a fly shibito's right in front of me and I can only really see its legs, even despite the camera being pushed upwards. It's more of a tilt compared to anything else. There's no way to look directly up at the sky or down to the ground. It's just not that type of camera system. It's a to and fro that will mainly depend on the player in my opinion. I could see some players finding it annoying considering everything else we're already dealing with, and I could see others appreciating what it does in terms of adding to the horror. I'm somewhere in between really. When it works, it really works, and when it doesn't, it can make things like certain combat encounters more of a chore than they may have otherwise been. One addition that I think's absolutely great, however, is our ability to play the game from an entirely different perspective. By pressing the right analog stick down, we can switch to a first-person point of view, with us also being able to press R2 to either enter this mode temporarily or to further zoom in. It's not an angle that I personally find myself playing from all too often, but I can definitely see certain players utilising this all the way throughout the game. I not only appreciate its sheer appearance in the first place, with not many games giving you the option to switch between these two perspectives whenever you want, but it's also great to enter this mode when you want to observe something a bit more closely. And considering how much you've heard me praising the visual design already, I do very much find myself entering this mode to zoom into all the gory details. And not to mention, the controls are completely unchanged. You turn the same, run the same, and attack the same. So it really is personal preference on how you want to observe the experience. Something I've always appreciated in regards to how we view this game is the almost complete absence of UI elements, creating an experience that's supremely immersive, just like I think any good horror game should be. There's no icon in the bottom showing what weapon we're holding, no ammo counter when holding a firearm. Blood Curse works off the pure essentials, cutting out much of the clutter that I feel too many games suffer with. For what UI elements there are, they're brought in sparingly and are fully dynamic. These are things like the messages that appear when completing or updating an objective, ones that show up at the top of the screen telling us what button picks up an item or opens a door, and also those sub-commands that show up on screen when pressing the D-pad. Arguably the worst of these UI elements is the DualShock controller that shows up, indicating how you need to move your controller to perform an action. And much like everything related to the motion controls, I don't think it needs to be here to begin with. That really is about it though, excluding the sight jacking, as that's its own mechanic entirely. Blood Curse is a game that leaves our screen pretty clear for the vast majority of its runtime, a facet you'd have to say is particularly important, given how hard it can be already to see the environments we're dealing with. As I discussed, with the gameplay being fairly simplistic, and the game's style very much being placed over its functionality in many cases, there's no need for an expansive UI system. Even certain features that you could almost describe as a UI element, like the flashes on screen which notify you've been spotted, they're made to blend so well with the overall look of the game. They're quite literally the opposite of distracting. They're contributing to the game's style. As for the mission itself, the two main highlights outside the nasty environment we're exploring has to be the two unique shibito we find here, one of these being the brain of this stage, with this one being supremely fast and having a head that resembles a wasp. And the other being the final return of Seigo as a shibito, who we once again find shooting us from a rooftop. I'd say it's Seigo and the police officer that are the most standout of the minor recurring characters we see across the game, becoming secondary antagonists in a way, especially with the policeman, because of the connection we develop with this guy, due to it being the first shibito we encounter. Every subsequent time we see him, we start developing a sort of rivalry, resurfacing every time he attempts to stop us progressing forward. Additionally though, I like how both of these reinforce the tight-knit nature of the village that I mentioned previously. We can use our mind to fill in some of the blanks, and flesh out what these guys may have been doing while our other characters progress. Seigo, for example, has presumably just been wandering about the village, attempting to find any of the survivors. And as for the police officer, with the many encounters we have with him, from seeing him crash his car to eating in a local restaurant, we start getting a feel of what his daily routine may have been, and this is the case for many of the shibito we see throughout the game. When finally arriving at the nest's core, we get a cutscene that essentially shows this first timeline I mentioned coming to an end. Sam appears to be on the very brink of transitioning into a shibito. Amana seems to have performed the ritual with Miyako, summoning the god we've been hearing about, but with us not getting a clear view of it currently. And while Howard does witness this, he for some reason ends up back outside, being given the objective of driving away the shibito brain. A bit awkward if I'm being honest. The fact that he's come face to face with this godlike being and just somehow escaped doesn't make much sense. From here though, it's a matter of journeying deeper into the nest, discovering the maggot shibito, who, judging by its facial features, now seems to have the face of Bella, or at least a different one than we saw previously. And upon climbing up the nearby smokestack, getting a small diversion in between where we get the reveal of the Spider Sam shibito, we arrive at a storehouse. Entering inside, we find Bella sitting in a corner, getting a pretty shocking discovery when she looks up.
Little girl. It's horrible.
Get away from her.
Amana claims that none of this is right. The cyclical Ouroboros we've mentioned is somehow not being fulfilled, and as the nest appears to start collapsing, we get several flashbacks to previous events, leading all the way back to our first encounter with a police officer, and even our first meeting with Amana. In a quick-fire way, what's relayed to the player in this moment is that we've now entered a different timeline, and that's where the importance of the Ouroboros lies. As we'll eventually see, we have physically gone back in time, with all these elements very much being in the vein of the whole multiverse idea. Us as the viewer, but witnessing the transition from one timeline to another, the decisions that were made and the actions that were taken in the previous one were deemed inadequate by Amana. We'll see later on how the desired result isn't exactly one where all parties, even Amana, get what they want. Events like the sacrifice of Miyako and the death of Bella and Howard don't benefit the ultimate objective, with that ultimate objective being cyclical in itself, revolving around the survival of a certain character that's at the heart of all this madness, as well as to keep this loop as a whole ongoing. When embarking on this new timeline in episode A, we can see instantly these loops aren't exact, and that goes for where our characters find themselves and also how they react to what they see. When running into Amana, for example, unlike before where Howard trusted her and followed her to the end of the stage, he instead runs away.
Are you alright?
It's unclear why exactly this is right now, however. The first instinct would be to assume that he's somehow retained his memory upon going back in time. However, when cutting to the next scene featuring Soul and Sam, these two have found themselves in a different place entirely. The mines were at least the first place Sam travelled to, but we know for a fact that in the previous timeline, Soul was looking after Bella in the forest, and we most definitely didn't see these two interact here before. So, are these things based off memory? Does Howard actually remember who Amana was? Or is this just a new reaction he's having in this separate timeline? timeline. Either way, it's an important thing to establish. Despite being trapped in a loop, these timelines do vary and change. A good piece of information to know in terms of the storyline, but also when it comes to the game, it opens up new gameplay opportunities without the risk of creating a massive plot hole. I will note in regards to the character's memories, however, although it's unclear how much is actually retained from the previous timeline, we can see from the vision Sol receives that he seems to remember himself getting killed. Considering the human form he finds himself in, we know this can't be from the current timeline, because as we know, death results in you becoming a shibito, so surely it has to be from the first one. When it comes to their ultimate aims, however, Sam and Sol have both reverted back to finding Melissa and Bella, with the objective here simply being to reconvene with Sam and get out the mines. So again, it's like a twist on the initial time we escaped the mines, with Melissa now being replaced by Sol. With that being said, due to how similar everything is, intentionally so obviously, it doesn't give me a substantial amount to talk about. The shibitos have all reverted back to the regular states for now, so we're not witnessing any new types in this one, and aside from the broader area we're given compared to the mission with Melissa and Sam, as I say, our goal's the exact same. There are two things that I felt were highlighted prominently in this one, however, one of which can occur at several points throughout the game, and the second being something that I don't think happens anywhere else. The first is the idea of the executions we can perform on some of these. However, I've always been quite unclear on how prevalent these actually are in this game. The two I witnessed in this stage are very blatantly preset, those being the execution of the lookout, who we hit and push down the nearby drop, and the other being a shibito who we can throw onto a spike. These are both directly tailored to the environments and objects which surround them, so it's clear to assume that these types of executions can only happen in these specific levels at these specific areas. There are some others, however, that seem to occur at absolute random, or at least that's how it seems to me. These are ones that are only dependent on the weapon you're using, so if you activate an execution on a spider shibito with a metal pipe, you'll see your character hit them with it and then stick it into them. The executions are yet another gory element that I appreciate every time they're shown to me, giving us these brand new angles and cutting out all the background noise to make the kill even more impactful. However, especially when it comes to these more pre-baked ones, I love the creativity we see in many of these. Once again, it does remind me quite a bit of the executions we bear witness to in games like Dead Rising 2. While most of them are just outright brutal, there's also others that are pretty hilarious, like the instances where we can just push one of the shibitos down one of the elevator shafts here. And while this could be more of a personal thing, the fact that I've never been able to consistently pull these off in the general gameplay only made their eventual appearance even more impactful. It's kind of like the glory kills from the recent Doom games. While they are great all the way throughout, they undeniably have their impact lessened to a degree, because of how often we're likely seeing them. As for the second feature that remains more unique to this level, this is the only time in the game where we actively switch perspectives during the same mission. It's not a case of finishing with Sol, getting a cutscene, and moving on to a separate level like usual. Upon discovering the power shut off, with there being no way to head up one of the nearby elevators, we switch over to Sam, where we go find a weapon, take out the shibito standing in front of the control panel, and switch on the elevators. The feeling of teamwork that you yourself are achieving feels great. The only thing that could have enhanced a moment like this in my opinion is if the teamwork and the switch over to Sam was more reliant on you. As it is, we get stuck and are forced into Sam's point of view, whereas there could have been a nice moment in which the players are made to figure out themselves that to progress with Sol we need to use Sam, as well as our memory of this level previously. I understand that would also mean introducing a GTA 5 type character switching system for one Sol mission, so I'm not surprised it's conveyed in this way. But I do think it's a bit of a shame we never see anything like this again particularly. In a game that features plenty of levels where you're paired up with a teammate, it would have perhaps been nice to see certain set piece and puzzle moments that rely on the pair working together, not only deepening the gameplay, but also the relationships and bonds these characters develop. Like we've just seen, the second mission featured during episode 8 has us returning to a familiar environment at the exact same time, but with a slight alteration. Last time it was 3 AM at Saiga Hospital, it was simply Bella who was trying to contact her parents and make her way out. Now, Melissa finds herself alongside Bella, in which we once again need to escape the hospital. Aside from the small diversions we get, like how we switch on the power, or climb out a window and move a sign from the entrance door to let Bella escape, the level really is quite similar. That's one of those things where I can see the intentionality, but don't know if I'm fully on board with it in a gameplay sense. As for the events that are retold, I like like that side of things, having Soul show up as a shibito once again is great, especially given the way in which this moment's conveyed. It's once again a reinforcement of how these events are actively repeating what we'd already experienced, something I definitely find to be important, as I do think there'll be quite a few players at this point who are still potentially confused as to why they're seeing the same general story getting retold again. My only problem would be that unlike the previous occasions where we come back to locations we've been to before, there's not as much variation when it comes to what we see and experience. When we return to the hospital as Melissa for the first time, for example, we bear witness to a brand new shibito type and a shibito brain. Not to mention, the route to our objective was quite a bit different as well, featuring that puzzle moment that utilizes sight jacking and having us travel onto the roof to reach the other side of the hospital. This is literally almost the exact same as episode 3, with the only change coming from how we can now defend Bella and ourselves when playing as Melissa. As I say, I get what they're going for with this repetition, but to have this conveyed in the gameplay too was slightly underwhelming. Even in the missions prior to this that may have seemed quite similar, there was always something that put a unique spin to the experience. Because bear in mind, even if it was the most minor of things like the switch up in environments when it came to the time of day or weather effects, we're now in a situation where things like that are intentionally getting replicated. Luckily, I wouldn't say this applies to many other levels from here on out, with that also applying to the next one we enter upon starting episode 9. Staying with Melissa and Bella, we return to the time and location where Howard initially met Seigo and Miyako. The main thing highlighted here is the rearranging of the second timeline, with us starting this one off by getting ran off the road by the giant maggot shibito, a foe who wasn't at all present at this point in the first one. And upon making our way past the shibito scattered amongst these fields, we get a very clear callback to the way in which Bella was killed during the first timeline, that being from a tree that was thrown onto her by the same maggot shibito. It's not purely that these are brand new diversions, it's the fact that they're occurring at completely different points of time, meaning that while Howard was previously here escorting Miyako, he's now found himself elsewhere, with this being the same for all the other characters we've seen so far as well, simply making it even clearer how all these events have the potential to be altered, despite still being trapped inside a loop. Talking of this final sequence with the maggot shibito, while Bella doesn't find herself getting crushed this time due to how Melissa pushes her out the way, she does still end up getting her foot stuck. That takes us to the final moment of this one, and the only part which resembles anything new when looking to the gameplay. Unfortunately though, I've always found this segment somewhat annoying, predominantly because of how the maggot shibito acts. The scenario as a whole is rather inconsequential. It's purely a matter of knocking over some oil drums around the area to hopefully set the thing on fire. Issue is, however, everything here is just presented very awkwardly. Essentially, it's all about knocking over the barrels while simultaneously distracting the maggot so it doesn't go after Bella. Already in this, we start seeing jank that immediately removes tension from the set piece. Much like every time Bella's placed in some form of danger, it seems they opted against any kind of violence being shown towards her. A surprising choice if we're being honest. Considering how brutal this game is already, it's odd that games like Skyrim decide it's a-okay to go around whacking kids over the head, and Blood Curse doesn't. That's fine obviously, but especially in situations like this, it does make the behaviour of the shibito seem particularly strange. At least in the previous levels, you were either playing as Bella yourself, with the interaction you were having with the scenario kind of disguising how there was no damage being dealt to you, and even in the level we just saw with Melissa and Bella in the hospital, Bella at least was able to run away from these guys. Keeping her stuck under this tree simply results in the maggot walking into a wall, making its behaviour look very glitchy, and ultimately taking away the scare factor somewhat from a foe that's drop dead terrifying in every other department. The other issue I have is how frustrating it can be to lure this thing away from Bella. I had a good few attempts at this because of how fast we're made to fail upon having the maggot wander up to Bella, and I come away still not really knowing the most effective way to get this thing away from her. Shouting doesn't work, standing in its way doesn't work, and even hitting it occasionally isn't good enough either. Not to mention that in one attempt where I managed to draw its attention away, all it took was one hit for it to go right back to Bella and fail me in a matter of seconds. What could have worked as a unique gameplay sequence that acts almost as a pseudo boss fight is turned into one I just find outright annoying. However, when eventually knocking over 3 of these oil drums, Melissa decides to sacrifice herself when getting picked up by the maggot shibito, throwing the lighter she's carrying onto the ground, and setting both the maggot and herself alight.
I did it, Mommy! I love you, Bella! Run!
Cutting back to Seigo, we've got yet another case of something being outright repeated at the exact same time of day, with only minor differences. Seigo himself starts off by questioning the reality he finds himself in, asking if he's already experienced the events that are playing out around him, and upon witnessing Bella getting chased by Soul, it seems that much like ourselves, Seigo appears to identify the very similar situation he experienced when saving Sam in the previous timeline. Much like Howard, it seems like most of these characters appear to recollect certain parts from the previous timelines, but still find themselves mostly grounded in the reality they currently find themselves in. The initial part of this stage is quite literally the exact same, with the only difference coming from how, unlike Sam could, Bella's got no way of defending herself without our help. In saying that, we're now starting to see the importance of Bella in terms of the narrative. Regardless of how the others may feel about her, we can now see that characters outside of her parents are assisting her in progressing forward, signifying the greater purpose she has towards the plot as a whole. However, the best part of this level comes about after Bella's made her escape, being told to go and acquire the ancient book, getting one of the weirdest encounters in the game upon searching for it. This single moment encapsulates perfectly what I was talking about earlier, in regards to following pure creative ideas, even if there's no real explanation behind them. I bring the man up a lot, but David Lynch is my go-to guy whenever thinking about this kind of approach. Now don't get me wrong, unlike some of his critics seem to think when watching his movies, all the bizarre things he includes in them do have a purpose. It's just that usually, they're not being inserted to be observed on a literal basis. Games like Siren Blood Curse stem from that same vein, with the only difference being that with a lot of things here, I'm not taking anything away in a symbolic or metaphorical level, but that's perfectly fine. Because so many things we see in this game are beyond abstract, it leaves a door open for others to perceive these things in a much deeper way than someone like I might. In my view though, that's mostly irrelevant when observing what's presented in the final product, because I find the visuals themselves to be so unique and bizarre, and I'm talking in terms of any piece of media I've personally witnessed. That is enough to make the experience satisfying. Why is there a giant green head now located in a closet? I have absolutely no idea, but it's the sheer fact that it's here in the first place which I appreciate the most. It brings me back to a point of how focus tested and generic I found so many games have become nowadays, with how expensive games have now become to make, and the audiences these companies are appealing to being larger than ever. To me at least, there's so many games now that feel like they're playing things safe, not wanting to go too extreme with particular elements that may be off-putting to certain audiences, not going with outlandish and abstract ideas, purely because they can't be justified with absolute logic and reason. It comes back to the point, why is there a head in this closet? Who knows and who cares? All I think that matters is the impact it has on me as the player and what it makes me feel. Don't get me wrong, I don't think the problem lies with the audience. If I saw more games including the outlandish content a game like Blood Curse does nowadays, I feel like it would still be fully embraced by fans of the horror genre. It's more an issue of how many hands are now involved in game development, whose money's getting spent, what level of involvement they have in the project. A relatively simple moment like this in Blood Curse was a heavy reminder to me of how few and far between these kinds of occurrences are, ones that have stuck in my mind for years, and immediately resurface when being asked what some of the creepiest games I played are. But getting back to the point, I think what I've described is how I personally answer that. I think many players like myself are simply searching for games that are presenting something truly original, and from top to bottom, a game like Blood Curse has been exactly that, from its story, to the characters, to the world. I heavily disagree with the sentiment some people try to claim that we've simply reached a point where nothing is truly original anymore. Everything is imitating what came before it. But understand, that's been said many times throughout history, and has always been proven false. For what games and films may garner from past influences, there's still endless potential for brand new ideas to be conveyed in these media formats. I merely question why this potential's being stifled. We already know there are hugely creative and talented figures in the gaming scene, so why does it seem like so few are being given the opportunity to really shine? Upon acquiring the ancient book, we get another cutscene showing several revelations from multiple characters. Howard has a flashback to a situation where Miyako mixed her blood into his system, with her dialogue hinting this is the only way in which he's one of the few people who finds himself unaffected by the blood rain, never transforming into a shibito. Sam, however, stumbles upon something even more important, a book that seems to explain the loop they found themselves in. The main takeaway from this moment arguably being Sam's reaction. We've already pieced together what it is these characters are experiencing, but for the first time, it seems like Sam at least is being made aware of this loop, and the inevitable futures that are prophesized in this text. Cutting back to Bella, she seems to have found herself trapped in the same Tabori settlement that we previously entered with Howard and Miyako. Much like every time I found myself taking control of Bella, the sense of vulnerability is basically the first thing which immediately makes me nervous, as if being stuck in a small house with this family of freaks wasn't bad enough. We've also got to somehow find a way out. I love some of the details we witnessed during this opening in the closet, however. Because of how we're made to wait until each of the family members leaves the room, we get a great chance to witness their behaviour even more closely, as well as minuscule details that give these environments even more personality. Outside their appearances and general behaviour, judging by how these guys act, you'd honestly think they're just a regular family. They all start off sat around the table watching static on the TV screen, where we can even see when looking at the father here, he's got a cigarette in his hand, one that he could even potentially be smoking, judging by how there seems to be ash on the end of it. Keep the environment in mind here as well. While these surroundings aren't what you describe as normal, with many of the glass doors appearing smashed, and the house as a whole being in a state of relative disrepair, look at how this living room's been set up. Bowls, cutlery, and teapots set up on the table, like preparation for a meal, and given that we now know what the vision of a shibito looks like, we can assume this family's entirely unaware of the state they actually find themselves in, and think they're simply indulging in some regular family time. As for those minor details I was talking about, these are very small things which I personally appreciate, that many people won't particularly care for or even notice, but I thought I'd bring them up regardless. These would be things like the several moths we can see flying around the light on the ceiling, adding to the atmosphere of the scene when it comes to the sounds they generate and the shadows they create around the room, while in the closet we can eventually see a small spider descend from a web in front of us. Again, another nice detail that makes the world feel more alive, but equally being a nice reference to the many spider shibito we've been seeing already. And then taking a look round simply this one individual room, I once again have to appreciate the care that's clearly been put in to make it feel as authentic as possible. The pillows on the floor which the family members would sit on, the rotating fan we can see, the Japanese artistry and figurines. It once again goes a long way to emphasise the contrast between how these people live their lives and how they lay out their furniture, for example, compared to the Westerners that we're typically in control of. Again, it's the authenticity of it that's the highlight for me. The fact that I find this environment entirely believable, even despite the wrecked nature of it. With that being said, however, there is something you may have been able to observe in all this, as well as across most of the game so far, that ends up revealing another discovery in regards to the space-time continuum of this universe. If you've been paying close attention to the environments we've been witnessing throughout the game, as well as things like the clothing many of the shibito are wearing and the hairstyles they have, all of it seems quite old-fashioned. Compared to the hoodies and t-shirts our characters are shown to be wearing, we can see from the styles and patterns of the shibito's clothing, these are clothes that you can imagine people wearing decades in the past, not in 2007 when this game's set. As I've already established, space-time in general is completely out of whack around Hanuda, and like I was previously discussing in regards to what does and doesn't get elaborated on, there's no real reason as to why this is. It's where the game takes place, it's where these villagers perform the ritual, that's just how it is. But it's in that ritual, and more importantly, the one we observe at the start, which is the root cause as to why this loop's been created, and why we're seeing this strange blending of different periods. We'll discuss these more heavily when some of the bigger revelations are given to the player, but it's another element of the game's story that I found myself appreciating when returning to it subsequent times. Initially, you may not even notice things like the 1970s style clothing most of the shibito are wearing, which I would say is reflected in many of the environments to a degree as well, but upon learning why these things appear in this way, it makes these decisions feel even more considered, deepening the intricacy of the plot, and giving more for players to become intrigued with upon investigating further. As for our escape, it's not too dissimilar to how we escaped this place last time. However, instead of winding up clocks and taking out shibito to acquire the same bedroom key, we can once again use the hiding spots to our advantage by waiting in one of the adjacent rooms until a certain shibito places down this key in the very same room. When picking it up and unlocking the door, we end up walking into another bizarre situation where one of the shibito appears to be laying in bed. Given the fact that when sightjacking into this guy's vision, his eyes are wide open though, we can once again assume this is purely imitation and that he's actually awake, giving an extra feeling of creepiness when sneaking past him. And talking of creepy, the most terrifying part of this mission has to go to the ending, where just as it seems we've escaped, we run into a familiar face.
Bella!
Mommy?
Bella!
Mommy!
Bella, it's Mommy.
This moment in particular is another one that stood out vividly to me throughout the years, and while I don't find it too difficult to get past nowadays, the whole setup is just horrendously scary to me. The gameplay here is all about creating distance between you and Melissa when running around the house. Due to how she ends up locking the door to the exit, we need to buy ourselves a bit of time to unlock it and then run away. This in itself might actually be quite tricky to pull off in your first few attempts, and that links directly into what makes the sequence so scary. First to be the fact that it's Melissa who's chasing after us. Outside of Howard and Miyako, she's the only one who we haven't yet seen turn into a shibito, so that's already a pretty unnerving surprise. Putting things into perspective, there's also something equally terrifying about the relationship between these two characters. A mother, who in all other instances has tried to protect her child, even going to the lengths of shooting another human, now finding herself chasing after her with the sole aim of doing harm. And that's the final thing that's always made me dread coming back to this moment. While she may be slow to begin with, Melissa can eventually find herself entering this frenzied state, where she can run incredibly fast. The speed in itself is scary. Simply witnessing that on its own makes us realise that if we aren't positioning ourselves quite right, there's basically no way of outrunning her. What this also does, however, is turn the final moment where we unlock the door into one that's supremely tense. Whenever you start unlocking it, Melissa's always made aware, instantly dashing towards your position. That's where players will most likely experience failure, as even if she's in a position that's somewhat close to yours, the speed of her movement will result in her catching you before you can escape. Even if she doesn't though, it's a moment which once again highlights the importance sight jacking can bring, and the unique scares that come along with it. Without having Melissa's point of view flashed up on screen, being able to see how close she is to us and how far she's running, the situation would still be tense, but nowhere near the same level. We're continually made aware of how close we are to failure, and to have that reinforcement come in the way of a fast-paced shibito who once served as our only form of protection, it's all pretty terrifying. Cutting back to Howard, we see that he's finally reconvened with Miyako, where several plot details get relayed to us in the most blatant way we've seen as of yet. The loop we're stuck in is outright confirmed by Miyako, and when getting a brief glimpse of Amana, she says that in this timeline, she's going to perform the true ritual, confirming that what we witnessed in the previous one was that same ritual gone wrong. Especially in the case of characters like Howard, their efforts start seeming hopeless when you really start breaking everything down. Despite how their ultimate intention is to fight back against Amana's ritual to hopefully break out the loop, all of their actions are only really feeding into it. As is laid out by Sam in one of his journal entries towards the end of the game, the only way to truly break this loop is to go directly to the root cause. Although as we'll see, it seems like certain characters are unwilling to do this, due to what they may lose in the process. Having characters that don't particularly appear like villains arguably become one in many ways. What Howard and Miyako find themselves doing here is breaking several seals that are now scattered throughout the fields, which from a gameplay standpoint is all based around navigating to 4 different points around the fields at large. Despite being another mission purely based on navigating our environment, I do enjoy how it's getting fully utilised in this case. Many missions we've seen throughout the game seem to only focus on individual segments of a level. If we use this one as an example, there's one seal here that's only made accessible after closing a floodgate, cutting off the water supply to a small pathway that holds the final seal at the end of it. The valve that's used to close this floodgate lies in a part of the level that's quite literally had no purpose up till now. And additionally, this is also where we end up finding the shibito brain, so I'm a fan of that already. If there's an environment that's been constructed for us to explore, encourage the player to go and explore it, for what it may do in fleshing out the world slightly more. There's no point including these kinds of areas if they're entirely irrelevant to our ultimate progression. As for the look of the level, we find ourselves at a point once again where the blood-red skies and dark surroundings have been replaced with ones that appear far more ordinary, with the only real thing that presents a fear factor in my opinion being the fog, that still does a great job at hiding many of the shibito lurking within it. I will say though, I do enjoy the subtle visual changes we see applied to this one, upon breaking each individual seal, because as you're able to see, every time we break one of these, a new blue beam of light can be witnessed hovering in the sky, with them also being accompanied by a subtle humming sound. I think this does a good job in reinforcing the importance of the actions we're taking. With every seal we break, the visuals and sound effects feel like they're gradually building towards a culmination of some kind, actively pushing us forward to achieve what at this point is one of the final steps in our journey. One thing I will say I didn't appreciate much during this one is a problem that I discussed at the start, and for newer players has likely remained a recurring issue throughout their entire playthrough. Even as someone who's played this game countless times, this was the only level where I found myself entirely stuck, because I couldn't find that valve to shut off the floodgate. Navigating my way to every other seal was perfectly fine, so I was questioning why this final one was so hard to get to, and as you may have guessed, the reason this floodgate was made so hard to discover was because of a lack of clarity in the environment once again. Just like the opening opening mission, I find Blood Curse very much struggles with the dynamic of nice visual design versus what's practical and helpful to convey to the person playing the game. It's an issue that arguably stems from a combination of how restrictive our forms of progression can be, as well as how broad some of our objectives are. When you're told escape from the police officer, I wouldn't say it'd be unusual for a player to feel like they've got some freedom in the situation. However, I can imagine the gradual discovery that escaping from the police officer actually means go up this sole pathway and enter this single hiding place would be met with a mix of disappointment and frustration, and that pathway is what I'm talking about in the case of this level. What was one of the first things we pointed out with that one? It was such a weird way to open the game because of how unclear this pathway was made to be when taking into account all the darkness and shrubbery that surrounded it, and even during a level like this one where the environment's considerably brighter, that same issue still somehow persists. The only thing marked on our map is the seal itself, so we've quite literally got no guidance whatsoever when it comes to finding the valve. And where is the valve hidden? Behind a pathway that blends in so much to the surrounding scenery that I quite literally had no idea it was there until I searched up the answer online. That's the only real annoyance I had with this one, and the only reason I'm focusing so intently on it isn't because of this one sole experience I had. It's not only an example of how even a player like myself, who's essentially familiar with this game from top to bottom, can still find themselves lost, but it's also what I imagine many other players who are less familiar with the game would have also experienced several more times before this moment. Because as I say, for as much as I think these environments excel in the visual department, I really do find they fall short in terms of the level design. There's just far too much restriction getting placed on where you're able to go, and what pathways help you in progressing forward. There are so few examples in which pathways intercede, which in a way ends up giving me a whole lot more appreciation towards the level design in many other games I played. Some of the best examples would obviously be games like Dark Souls or Bloodborne, games that feature environments constructed in brilliant ways, to where you'll find shortcuts back to areas you've journeyed to before, and multiple different pathways that on the surface may seem like they're going to lead you to another part of the same area, before then taking you to a brand new area entirely. If we applied Blood Curse's level design to Firelink Shrine, for example, we wouldn't get the option to enter the catacombs or New Londo ruins. Undead Burg would be the only way forward. But even if we want to look to examples of games that don't get too much credit nowadays, take a look at the level design of pretty much any Call of Duty campaign, especially ones like World at War or Modern Warfare, and you'll find that in the vast majority of levels, there's multiple different pathways to reach your end goal. And for a game that I find to be infinitely more creative in essentially every department compared to the COD franchise, it's a shame that it falls so short when it comes to the level design for most of these. Upon breaking the seals, the blue lights shoot up into the sky, coalescing and opening up some kind of portal. However, with the arrival of Amana, she knocks Howard out, assumedly taking away Miyako to attempt the ritual once again. Interestingly though, Seigo ends up discovering Howard, as well as Bella, who's hiding in the bushes nearby. Whereas before, where Seigo acted either aggressively or rather impassively to these two, it seems like he's now willing to actively help them out, with it being pretty clear from how he's acted prior to this that he won't be doing this out of pure generosity. He acknowledges their ultimate importance in the whole situation, and seems to now be figuring out a plan to stop Amana's antics. When starting the next episode, we get one of the only occasions where no recap's given, which is quite strange given how consistent they've been with all the recaps in the other episodes. But hey, I'm not complaining. In this cutscene, we get a precursor towards a future mission that will take place with Howard and Bella, as well as a flashback that shows what Seigo was getting up to while Howard was sleeping. And needless to say, Seigo's shown to be a bit of a maniac when he's not on guard duty.
Well, I was waiting for you to wake up. I've been doing a little experimenting.
You're sick in the head.
You're more than welcome to stay as long as you like, but I have work to do.
With that, Seigo sets off to the mines to acquire something referred to as the Urian, where as you could guess, the route towards this thing has us making our way into the same cramped mine shafts that we've seen several times before. The nurse makes an appearance right at the start of this one, now featuring several red tentacles shooting out her face. She works as the brain for this level, however, unlike the others, she doesn't die permanently until we acquire a stake and ram it into her heart. Something else I enjoy about the start of this one is the noticeable similarity we can see to Siren 1, most prominently with the shibito rifleman we see when making our way out the initial tunnel. That's where the whole remake side of the game really shines through, especially when it comes to areas like the fields. You can very much see how while the translation from Siren 1 may not be exact, there was definitely a significant amount of influence garnered from the layouts in that game. The mines are one of the areas that I think have had quite a substantial redesign, but it's still interesting to see what was retained and what was switched up. Remember the start of episode 6, where Seigo waited for us at the end of that long, foggy stretch of track? That moment's basically translated one for one with the first game. And in saying that, when looking at that moment in Siren 1, we not only see how the positions are ultimately reversed, but we can also see that unlike Blood Curse, where the area to the left is almost immediately met with a cliff edge, in Siren 1 there's another house we can witness, and a road leading towards an exit. Linking this back to the shibito I discussed at the start of this one, that's something else that was translated one for one. If you remember, this small building is where we activated the siren from with Howard. And looking back to the first game, this exact same building not only has the exact same purpose of activating a siren, but also features a shibito sat on top with a rifle. Now, for many, I'm sure this won't serve any relevance or importance whatsoever, and I suppose when looking at Blood Curse individually, it really doesn't. But I thought it was a good thing to point out to show the clear reverence and significance the first game had when it came to how Blood Curse was designed. I've only given a few examples here, but rest assured, even if there's not scenarios or environments getting translated directly, for those who are familiar with Siren 1, you can observe quite clearly the blueprint they're working off. It's something that I feel longtime fans will find themselves appreciating, with even the most minor of details like this rifleman getting a callback. Now with all that being said, this is yet another mission as Seigo, which is just a full-on power trip. Because of our shotgun, there's hardly any point where we're made to feel in any real danger, no matter what kind of enemy we're tackling, with the only real threat coming from the giant maggot shibito that stands directly in our way to the Urian, and that's what the entire level's based around. First navigating our way to the deepest point in the mine, acquiring the stake, eliminating the brain, and then collecting the Urian without the risk of getting killed by the maggot. Again, we've reached a point where there's really not that much to discuss, due to how we're dealing with a similar environment with a similar objective. The best part of this one is the process in which we take out the nurse, having to essentially outsmart her by turning off the elevators before she can escape. Trying to eliminate her otherwise simply results in a mad goose chase, where you're relying on the speed you can reach her before she cuts you off. When eventually making our way to the Urian, which appears to have been stashed away in a seemingly random crevice in the mines, we discover a sword beside it that disintegrates upon picking it up. And when looking at the Urian itself, it seems to be some kind of abstract black cube that's emanating a blue glow around it. Not too dissimilar to a concept like the monolith from 2001, a seemingly featureless object that's said to hold immense power. That's where we cut back to Howard and Bella, where we need to once again make our way into the shibito nest to eventually reach the core, hopefully this time stopping a mana before she can perform the ritual. Like the previous mission, however, I just don't find there's anything all that new. There's once again some new enemies placed in different areas, and a new gross brain towards the end of the stage. But I assume the main switch up they were going for here was the addition of Bella. The environment's exactly the same, and the way we personally navigate this environment is identical as well. The only points which differ slightly are the moments where we need to accommodate Bella. Because of how she's a kid, she can't make some of the jumps that we can, so we need to send her through a few separate routes at points. I'll be honest though, this has such a negligible effect on our progression. The most I can praise in this regard is that it gives this minor partnership of Howard and Bella a bit more life, but the time they spend together is so short anyways that it doesn't really matter. Wasted potential in my opinion, especially when it comes to the gameplay. You could have possibly had these moments where you send her forward on her own, present a bit of danger, perhaps having to reconvene with her in a certain time limit due to a shibito chasing after her, but we don't see anything like that unfortunately. The best part of the stage arguably comes right at the end when encountering the brain, introducing an idea that I would have perhaps liked to have seen during other points in the game. The most effective way to creep up on this thing that sits on the roof is by turning a lever on the ground level to roll out a sheet above the shop entrance. Doing this allows us to pass under the brain undetected, where we can then climb up the building and take it out. This kind of interaction with the environment's great. While not obvious, especially in a game that's as dark as this, I like the fact that close observation of our environment results in us getting rewarded with an effective way to progress. As I say, it would have been nice if this was something we were consistently seeing prior to this moment, as due to this moment essentially being a one-off, the player won't be accustomed to having an environment be interactable in this kind of way. I do love some of the things we see in this final section though. The reappearance of the police officer is very appropriate, given the fact it's the last time we take control of Howard in the Hanuda section of the game. And something else I particularly noticed here, which I have to assume can also be seen earlier in the game, is the more subtle fly-like behaviour we can witness, most noticeably when looking at some of the flies that land onto walls, and simply stay there until they notice you or you attack them. Reaching the core, Howard, as well as Sam, who also turns up, seem to be too late once again. Miyako's body bursts into flames, which now explains the giant smoke cloud we saw the last time we arrived here. And from the pool of blood, we see what appears to be this god we've been hearing about burst out, which, aside from the insect-like legs we see sticking out of it, takes on a form that's almost indescribable. Amana has the exact same reaction as last time, claiming that something's not right. This timeline's obviously different to the first one. Not only has Howard shown up early enough to actually witness the ritual take place, but so too was Sam, who quite literally never showed up in the previous one. With the arrival of Seigo, however, who ends up activating the Urian after getting impaled by this creature, he assumedly switches things up quite substantially. Compared to having the timeline repeat like last time, the creature seems to get struck by one of the many blue flames that begin falling out the sky. All of this works to set up the final two stages, the first of these having us take control of Sam, with his goal being to locate Bella. The small interaction we see between him and Howard works as a brief hint towards a very important detail that gets fully revealed by the end of the game, with this being the fact that despite seeming to not know each other, Howard believes that Sam had sent him a message, with the way in which he says this making it clear that without this apparent message, Howard likely wouldn't be in this mess to begin with.
If you see my Bella again, please make sure she's okay.
Wait, you're Sam Monroe? So you're the one who sent me the message.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Journeying forward, Sam ends up in the same place Howard did last time we were in the nest. However, unlike back then, where we mainly dealt with Spider Shibito, Melissa makes a comeback in the most horrific way imaginable. This edition alone turns what could have been a rather lackluster repeat into something way more engaging and extreme. You'd have to say the transformation we witness is one of the most extreme as of yet, so that's already quite interesting to observe. Melissa is a damn terrifying figure here, not only from the state she's found herself in, but also with the many quotes we hear her shout out to Sam, screaming at us to give back her baby, with there being that bizarre contrast once again of a humanistic trait shining through, with this absolute abomination. As I mentioned as well, this whole set piece is one that I find to be incredibly engaging, both in its setup and execution. There's a dual dynamic share between Sam and Melissa that makes the encounter feel more like a showdown. There's the more emotional side, with Sam having to deal with a hugely malformed version of his ex-wife, someone he clearly once cared for. And there's the other which coincides with the vast majority of interactions we see between them during the game, that being their near constant arguments and disagreements that show them continually butting heads. Either way, even when comparing Melissa to the other maggot Shibito we've encountered throughout the game, she's got the unique quality of constantly being in this frenzied state, somewhat similar to what we saw at the end of episode 8 where she chased after Bella. When making our way forward, it'd be one thing for Melissa to simply pursue or run after us, but we actually get more unique interactions here that make the scene feel even more lively. When stepping into the bus, for example, Melissa grabs onto the side and starts shaking it around, and shortly after this, she unexpectedly busts down a wall that's directly next to where we need to head. Especially in the case of that second occurrence, it's not only given the player an unexpected shock, but equally, it presents another challenge for them to overcome, having to think fast so you don't get attacked, and making a choice to either dash forward or perhaps retreating, and timing your movements more carefully. Either way, it keeps the encounter fresh, and turns Melissa into an even more intimidating foe. Despite taking on a form that we've seen several times already, it gives this version of the maggot even more personality, outside of it purely taking on the appearance of Melissa. It's made unique in both how it looks and behaves. The final part of this level flips everything on its head though. We go from running for our lives to outright confronting Melissa, as well as the spiders that eventually start flooding in. The first encounter with Melissa's quite simplistic, but can be very annoying. All you've got to do is pick up the many antennas scattered around the area and throw them at Melissa. Stick enough of these into her and you've won. The navigation towards these is fine, and as all the antennas which are throwable look the exact same, there's less issue in relation to how these realistically could have just blended into the environment. Actually throwing these was arguably the biggest problem for me though. You can very much tell this was something that was planned for one sole moment, because it really doesn't feel that satisfying. Sam can throw quite far, with the antenna itself having some dip in its trajectory, but a dip that's rather insignificant. Despite this, there were too many times where that antenna simply didn't end up sticking into Melissa, with me quite literally not knowing why. That's the sole thing which turns the fight into one that's potentially quite annoying, and it's purely the inconsistency of our throws. There's some attempts where I've had had no issues and every single one stuck easily. And there's others where I've used up every single antenna in the area and still couldn't succeed. It would still be a pretty awkward fight even if it did work consistently. But the fact there's been so many times where my crosshair's directly on Melissa and I'm at a good height and range from her, yet still somehow miss, it can become quite tedious. And that's something you could also apply to the final segment here, where after Melissa gets lit up by lightning when climbing up the smokestack, we're made to wipe out all the spider shibito which flood in that are going after Bella. The main problem here is the numbers we're dealing with. Because of the double-barreled shotgun that falls out the sky for absolutely no reason, we luckily have a weapon that can at least take these guys out with one shot. The random and sudden appearance of the shotgun somewhat gives the feeling of how this encounter may not have been thought out properly, and I'd say that also applies to the spider shibito we're made to deal with. I'll sum it up like this: replace the shotgun with the sawn-off, and it would have been perfectly fine. As it is, despite the effectiveness of the shotgun, because of how cramped and dark the area still is, on top of having a large number of the shibito thrown at you all at once, it can be very hard to even get a shot off at points. Up till now, there's not many occasions where multiple shibito find themselves attacking you at the same time, and even during situations where that is a possibility, you can always attempt to separate them by retreating, and then picking them off individually once they've lost you. Because of how we need to protect Bella at all times, that's not a choice here. The main problem realistically is the incredibly slow aiming speed, as well as how zoomed in the perspective is. When you're dealing with such a dark, tight environment with threats that have been purposely designed to be more compact and harder to lock onto, it would have helped if the camera itself wasn't working against you at all times. The ones going after Bella are fine to deal with because of the distance created between you and them. The ones that start going after us, however, can be a real pain. The size and speed these guys present can make it a bit of a nightmare when trying to get them in your crosshairs. And on the surface, most of what I've currently mentioned may sound like a non-issue, a tense scenario where we simultaneously protect Bella and ourselves. So what's the issue? My problem is that it feels more like a fight against the game compared to the shibito. I'm not thinking about Sam or Bella's survival. I'm mainly focused on how long it's going to take to focus on one of the spiders after repositioning myself and aiming once again. It's not too dissimilar to my feelings about the previous gameplay segment with Melissa. On the surface, the setup's generally quite standard, but in execution, it can feel more like you're fighting with the game and its controls. Getting past the gameplay segment, Bella and Melissa end up falling into some kind of orange void, and when cutting back to Howard, he also ends up getting pulled to some alternate reality when falling into the pool of blood.
Miyako?
Being referred to as Inferno, the place we end up seems to represent some kind of purgatory, a place that's in between the real world and Hanuda. We end up meeting Seigo here, who, bizarrely, after rescuing us, and seeming to be on our side during this whole timeline, now starts firing at us with his shotgun. Judging by his rather strange and nihilistic personality that we've seen throughout the game though, we can assume he's doing this as a way to give Howard one final test. It's been pretty clear for a while now that Howard's been written as the chosen one in this story. A very archetypal concept, but one that still works in this context. The important part of this, however, is the fact that he gives Howard the Urian, which after the first stage of the fight, we then use against him in a way that appears to kill him for good. Something we've already seen has been a desire of Seigo's, ever since he randomly blew his brains out during that first timeline.
With that, my part in this is finished. Yuki.
The only thing I'm unsure about, as it's never made 100% clear by the time the game's finished, is if Seigo's death here is permanent. Going off my own perception of these events, I'd have to assume what we see here is like a passing of the torch. In a way, what Seigo does here by choosing to fight Howard, who he likely already knows is the chosen one, is a selfish act that will finally set him free from this never-ending loop. With the sheer power this Urian's described to have, as well as how Seigo quite literally disintegrates, instead of transforming into a shibito once again, it's not a far shout to say he's actually been released from this nightmare. This means that Howard's essentially taken his place, being trapped in this loop for seemingly eternity. You may have noticed, I skipped right past the fight we have with Seigo, and that's because there's not much to really talk about. Apart from the brilliant environment, which shows a nice merging of these two different worlds, the fight itself is rather standard. First having Seigo shoot at us, then having him chase after us with a katana, and then finally having to set him alight with the Urian. There's nothing impressive whatsoever about how we take him out, and his AI leaves much to be desired, especially in the opening stage where both of you have firearms. That can appear outright goofy with how the two of you can be seen standing still just firing at each other. As for this passing of the torch I've mentioned though, I feel this is even further backed up with the appearance of Amana, with her repeating the exact same line to Howard about stealing the fruit, as she did with Seigo earlier.
You were the one who stole the fruit, so it was you who stole the fruit.
And from there, we end up receiving one of my all-time favourite closing sequences to any game I've ever played. As if the game hadn't already gone off the rails enough up to this point, the final encounter we have with this god, who we now discover is called Keiko, is one of the most memorable patches of gameplay I've ever experienced. Seeing it burst out of this fleshy pod, and essentially being a culmination of the strong adherence we've seen to the insect-like features on many of the different shibito. While being made up of parts that we can relate to flies, beetles and so on, Keiko once again takes on a form that appears so otherworldly and alien that I could only ever associate it with the Siren franchise. We're then taken directly into a final boss fight against it, which much like all the other boss type encounters throughout the game, I find to be rather lackluster in the mechanical department, but with that being heavily made up for in the visual one. The fight starts off interestingly, having Keiko remain unkillable until we tap into our sight jacking and use Miyako's vision to find and destroy a relic, both of these being invisible from Howard's point of view. From there, it purely becomes a case of running up to Keiko, blasting the ground with the Urian, and swiping our sword, which sends out a damaging shockwave. Do this enough times, and Keiko will eventually fail to put itself back together, in which we can then kill it for good. All relatively simple on the gameplay front, and I'll be honest, this isn't a fight where I feel like I'm in any real jeopardy at any point. As for how it looks though, I think the visuals are absolutely fantastic. Both Keiko and the arena are just so visually distinct, that as I say, anything that's lacking in the gameplay department is ultimately made somewhat irrelevant due to how outstanding I find the visuals to be. Keiko has two main forms that it transforms into, the first being the more upright beetle type form that we saw to begin with, and the other having these parts be rearranged to have the beast appear slightly broader in size, with multiple different insect parts floating around in a circular fashion. I love the fluidity of these insect parts, having Keiko frequently rearranging itself temporarily, and even fully disbanding before entering those two main states. We can't end this boss fight without talking about the arena though. Again, in terms of gameplay, there's nothing to really talk about. We're making our way across a completely flat plane with no other obstacles outside of Keiko itself. The highlight for me though, of course, comes from the way it's been designed, with the entire place being made up of many hexagonal shapes, all of which show these ever-changing, almost hypnotic patterns. Outside of looking fantastic, with the number of patterns we see here being broad, and with there being a good deal of variety when it comes to what kinds of patterns are being shown in separate parts of the arena, it does also present a challenge in the gameplay front. I will say though, I think for many players, this will end up presenting an outright negative towards the fight. The intention of this environment is quite clearly based on disorientating the player, giving him a harder time focusing on Keiko, and also making it quite hard at points to even locate it, despite having the environment be entirely open. And while I really enjoy the effect that's created, I know for a fact there'll be someone out there, maybe even a fair few people, who find this a bit too disorientating. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand that. As someone who's strongly hesitant towards formats like VR, that present essentially the exact same feelings, I get why certain players won't enjoy this final encounter. From my personal perspective though, we're back to that same point I brought up earlier about what developers do and don't put in their games anymore. No matter what way you want to look at it, including an arena like this for your final boss fight is undeniably a risk. The devs would have been well aware that there would be players out there who have an aversion to what's being presented, but the fact is, they were confident enough in what they were creating, and were given the freedom to approach the encounter in this manner, to where those issues become irrelevant. Remember, if you're continually creating things with the thought of what others may feel about it and how they may react, I don't know how you're ever supposed to create anything truly original or outlandish, because anyone can look at this environment and immediately identify that someone, somewhere, will have a problem with it. The same applies to other games I'm a big fan of, like Kane and Lynch 2. Yeah, the intense camera shake in that game will be unappealing to many, but I think it'd be foolish to say that wasn't a completely intentional decision, and as a result, I find games like that, as well as much of Blood Curse, even more commendable. These are games that go down pathways in which they know perfection won't be achievable on a wide scale. These aren't games like Red Dead 2, or Zelda, or any number of games that people rank as some of the best ever made. These are ones that are actively taking risks at almost all times, all in the pursuit of creating an original and unique experience. Now, that's not a slant on the other two games I've just listed. It's merely an acknowledgement that the more you start working with extremes and focusing on concepts that you you know some will be opposed to, the less chance you've got to have your game be widely perceived as a masterpiece. As much as I enjoy Blood Curse or Kane and Lynch 2 for example, I myself wouldn't class them as masterpieces. In their pursuit for certain goals that lie at the heart of their originality, other elements are noticeably more lackluster. But when you've got pieces of media like this that find themselves breaking away from conventions and genuinely presenting something you may not have ever experienced before, I'd argue that perfection almost becomes an irrelevance. If you've enjoyed your time with them, the memories that come to the forefront of your mind won't be the awkward controls or some underwhelming gameplay sequences. It's the elements of the game that differ from the norms you typically experience. And with all that being said, this boss fight is yet another encapsulation of that. It won't be for everyone, like Siren Blood Curse as a whole, but the admiration I feel towards a sequence like this, one that appears to be fiercely determined to pursue a path that many other creators would have thought was too unappealing. It's just something else that makes me realise why I've returned to this game so many times since I first played it, because much like many other elements that led up to this point, I'm being made to experience something that I'm just not able to find be achieved to the same degree anywhere else. After we defeat Keiko, we're shown Sam falling into the same void that Bella and Melissa fell into. Howard and Miyako appear to somehow make their way out of this abstract landscape they found themselves in, and Amana seems to wander off in the other direction. As Sam falls into the abyss, we get a brief flash of some more real-life imagery, the first showing what seems to be Bella getting confronted by someone, and the other taking us back to that disturbing scene we saw briefly during Amana's mission, where she was feasting on some kind of creature. And as we cut back to Sam, who now appears to have found himself in the 1976 version of Hanuda that we heard at the start suffered a devastating landslide, he lays out quite clearly how and why this loop will continue on.
Everything must be repeated, so that Bella can exist forever.
The game closes off with a hilariously cheesy ending, showing Howard essentially embracing the loop he's now stuck in, while heavy metal plays in the background. But even with all the info we've garnered throughout the game, many might still be confused by what we've actually witnessed. Luckily, however, taking a look at the archive on the main menu, there's a few things we can see here that give a bit more clarity to all the events we witness. The archive features both items we unlock upon completing missions, and also ones that we can find as collectibles throughout each level. Some are more important compared to others, but you can still see there's been a good deal of effort placed into every one of these, featuring items like ancient texts, cryptic drawings, ID cards, and even some voice notes from a few of the characters.
The events recorded in this holy book mirror our current situation so accurately that I'm beginning to doubt my own beliefs.
The most important of all these, however, is Sam's journal entry, being written in the years after he found himself in the 1976 version of Hanuda. Throughout this entry, he essentially lays out the entire plot in a far more blatant manner. He starts by saying that his memories and thoughts are starting to fade and blur together, with this assumedly being a side effect of the loop getting repeated once again. He clarifies that where we saw him end up during the final cutscene was very much the Hanuda of 1976, but he questions where him and the others found themselves prior to him falling into the void and arriving in this past iteration of the village. Was the ceremony that night the cause of all this? Was it something unique to the location? Or was it the power of some ancient angry god? Well, in a way, it's all those things, as Sam starts figuring out himself as the entry continues. Due to Howard's interruption of the ritual, the past and present merge together, creating a whole separate universe entirely. This explains factors I mentioned previously, like the old clothing we saw many of the shibito wearing. Elements from the past and present were merged together because of this failed ritual. Throughout the entire game, we're exploring a Hanuda that quite literally doesn't exist. The people that are contained within it and the environments we witness are oftentimes from two entirely different points of time. Another big revelation's given by Sam here, with him relinquishing blame from Howard and instead placing it onto his own daughter, Bella, saying she was the one who brought forth the call of that terrible siren to the world. But what does that actually mean? Well, to put it bluntly, Amana and Bella are the same person. Once again, again, just being shown at 2 different points of time, you might be wondering how Bella's truly to blame, and how she even ended up as the far more powerful, and as Sam confirms here, immortal Amana. Well, this ties back into those grim snippets we saw of Amana eating that fleshy substance. After falling into the abyss, and much like we see her do during the final moments of the game, Bella finds herself in yet another earlier version of Hanuda. The time she spends wandering around this past version of Hanuda is conveyed in another one of the archive's items. A piece of text referred to as Legends of Hanuda Village tells of a girl who prayed for help from a deep famine the village was suffering from. As a result, a giant creature, described to be a hybrid of an insect and fish, fell from the sky. The girl eventually gave in to her immense hunger and began eating the creature, which resulted in the sky becoming dark, and a loud sound that echoed throughout the land. If you remember, that's exactly what we witnessed during that final segment with Amana eating the flesh, with it now being made clear this creature was in fact Keichiro, the same one we battled during the final boss fight. This is where Bella becomes Amana, cursing the village while simultaneously becoming immortal. Looking back to Sam's journal, he wraps up by saying at the point of time he finds himself in, Howard knows nothing of him, and this universe's version of Sam, who still apparently exists, has no idea of what's about to occur. The idea of the Ouroboros is brought up once again, with Sam saying the beginning and the end are fused together, and as his mind starts to fade, he concludes by saying everything must be repeated so that Bella can live forever. Now, what's the conclusion here? Well, like the Ouroboros itself, this loop we've kept hearing about is present in many elements of the narrative, which, due to how much emphasis is put onto this concept, is a reasonable explanation as to why there's things which seem near impossible to comprehend. There's logical fallacies that are so blatant that many have described them as plot holes, and while I won't write that possibility off completely, it's quite hard for me to believe they weren't also intentional, considering how integral these abstract, incomprehensible ideas are to the game at large. The biggest one, of course, being the ritual itself. Amana was spawned from a version of Bella that visited Hanuda in 2007 before falling into a void and getting thrown back in time. Why was she visiting Hanuda in the first place? Because of a ritual that was taking place which Amana was directly responsible for. Point being, in the very first instance of this ritual taking place, with Howard coming in to interrupt it and having Hanuda break off into its own separate universe, how's Amana supposed to exist when Bella hasn't fallen into the void yet? But as I say, there's even more things within that which feed into the same indecipherable chain of events. Even if we remove the fallacy of Bella and Amana existing at the same time during this first ritual, how is it that Howard shows up? Considering he only gets the message from the version of Sam who fell into the void, how does that version of Sam exist in the first place if Howard wasn't already here to interrupt the ritual? That's what I mean about these plot holes being intentional. Trying to pinpoint a solid timeline is basically pointless. Just like the Ouroboros, there isn't a beginning or an end. If we are looking for the absolutes of this story though, all of which we witnessed in the timelines across the game, no matter how this loop truly came to be, the person to blame here, and the one who continues this horrific cycle, isn't Bella or Howard, it's actually Sam. So long as I'm reading everything correctly, if the version of Sam that ends up in 1976 Hanuda simply decides to not send the message to Howard, the loop will be broken. The only reason the events of Blood Curse take place is because Miyako isn't sacrificed, and Keiko becomes angered by the failed ritual, letting out its siren-like scream and rolling in the blood rain downpour. But that's the thing, as we can see from his journal, he's aware of all this, which leads to one of 2 possibilities in my mind as to why he continues to send Howard the message. The first could potentially be related to the merging of memories and loss of focus we hear about during this entry, perhaps resulting in him suffering a kind of partial memory loss, where he knows he needs to send Howard a message, but forgets what the consequences are, with this memory loss of course being shown off in the game itself. The second option, however, could simply stem from the desire to keep his daughter alive. The final line of him saying that everything has to be this way so Bella can live forever, it very much gives the feeling of Sam not wanting to let go of his daughter, despite the terrible events that occur as a result of that. This is something else we see reflected in the game as well. Less in Sam, but more with Melissa. Even when Bella turned into an outright monster, Melissa appeared to go quite literally insane, and not accept what had happened to her. So by the end of it all, the story we get in Siren Blood Curse is one that seems to be about as hopeless and depressing as possible. So long as Sam remembers who Howard is, he'll always send him that message, and because of the events that repeat themselves, it seems like it's impossible for Sam to reach this 1976 version of Hanuda without knowing of Howard at some point along the way. Aside from perhaps Seigo, who was freed by Howard, it seems like all the characters we see here are destined for the same nightmare repeating over and over, and considering how terrifying the world of Hanuda is, it's just about one of the worst nightmares I could possibly imagine. So that's Siren Blood Curse, a game that, as you would have gathered from everything we've discussed, won't exactly be appealing to everyone. For those who are aware and are familiar with the series at large, you'll likely hear him describe it as as an absurdly scary, ferociously original and worthwhile series to explore. And in many ways, I completely agree with that view. From the first time I played it all those years ago, I always held Blood Curse in very high regard. And even all these years later, where I've likely experienced 10 times the amount of horror games than I did back then, this game will always be one of the very first ones that will spring to mind if someone asked me to recommend them a truly frightening horror game. As I've brought up several times already, the trait I admire and find the most important with Siren is that it features things I quite literally can't experience anywhere else. The intriguing storyline, the unique gameplay mechanics, and the utterly bizarre threats we come up against. All this stuff is bursting with originality and personality, even if they're not pulled off to absolute perfection. All the environments we see look downright amazing, having a considerable amount of care when it comes to their designs, with some great attention to detail. While the gameplay may be lacking in certain areas, we still have brilliant mechanics like sight jacking to utilize. Not to mention, I find many of these issues related to lackluster gameplay are oftentimes overshadowed by the tense and horrific scenarios we're placed in. Blood Curse, and I suppose the Siren series at large, is definitely one where I don't think it's got the amount of attention it probably deserves. As I say, while it can be polarizing to certain players, there's too much here which I could almost guarantee would appeal to any fan of horror. But in saying that, I wonder if that lack of notoriety perhaps stems more from the interactive game side of things compared to the world of Siren. If I'm being honest, that's arguably the main thing that always draws me back. Not the combat, or the sneaking sections, or the navigation. I come back to look at these amazing environments, and wince at the vile creatures I'm encountering. The issues this game suffers from in the gameplay department could be its biggest flaw, and I think the worst part is, they're ones that will be consistent for almost anyone picking up the game for the first time. I've seen far too many playthroughs of Blood Curse where from the very first moment they're given control, the player aimlessly stumbles around the darkness and fails to escape the police officer, and that's not the player's fault. Even for someone like me who loves this game, I can see there are some glaring flaws in the game design sense. While the environments look great and create some brilliant atmospheres, the fact that many of these are not only so dark, but also are incredibly restrictive and linear can make navigation an outright nightmare. And unlike many other horror games that tend to spice up the sneaking and exploration segments with puzzle solving moments, or even more general mechanics like inventory or health management, that stuff's mostly absent in Blood Curse. Unless you count finding an item in a random room as a puzzle, the actual puzzle moments are few and far between. And in regards to the other two, we've got no inventory system at all, and our health regenerates automatically. Very few games actually achieve perfection, so I almost never go into an experience expecting it to be flawless. And when it comes to Blood Curse, while I do think there are elements that achieve near perfection, something I find to be a great feat on its own, there's also others which are nowhere close. But if I'm taking it for what it is, and looking at what Blood Curse is ultimately trying to achieve, I'd be lying if I didn't say it doesn't still hold up as a fantastic horror experience. I describe this game as one that keeps me consistently engaged, fascinated, and petrified from start to finish. With every stage we complete, every layer we peel back, and the deeper we journey into the game, the more strange and interesting it becomes. It's a game that's remained special to me ever since I first played it, and while it'd be great to maybe see another entry, or another game that perhaps stems from the same vein as Siren, that's ultimately what makes it so special. Much like you'll find with anything that resonates with you on a deep level, you're likely never going to find something that captures that same kind of feeling. That's what makes it special, and that's why I keep coming back to a game like Blood Curse. Because for all the advancements the video game landscape may have made since this came out, and the many horror games that have been released in between that time, there's nothing else that quite matches what it presents for me.
Yuki.